Before we drift away, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more calming sleep stories. Sweet dreams await. The rain had been falling all afternoon, soaking the forest floor until it smelled of moss, wet leaves, and smoke from a campfire someone had left smoldering in the distance. Ethan pulled his hood tighter, the steady hiss of rainfall on his jacket drowning out every other sound. The only path was a narrow trail lined with towering pines that leaned over him like watching sentinels. He wasn't lost, not exactly. He knew where he wanted to go. The old lodge. Locals called it Ashwood Lodge, though most avoided even speaking its name. They said the place was cursed, that campers had gone missing in those woods, that the fire in its hearth never truly died, even after the building had been abandoned decades ago. Ethan didn't believe in curses. He believed in stories though, and Ashwood Lodge promised him one worth finding. As he walked deeper, the sound of the rain shifted. It no longer sounded like drops on leaves. It became heavier, thicker, almost as though something unseen was moving through the branches above him. Then, crack, a branch snapped behind him. He turned, his breath misting in the chill. Nothing. Just trees swaying and the smell of damp bark. Ethan exhaled slowly. It's just the forest, nothing more. But the lodge was waiting, and he had no idea what waited inside its walls, or what was already watching from the shadows around him. The rain picked up, and with every step toward Ashwood Lodge, the woods grew darker. The trail narrowed as Ethan pressed deeper into the forest, his boots sinking into the mud with every step. The rain was steady now, whispering against the canopy, dripping down his hood and running in cold rivulets down the back of his neck. The forest seemed endless, and yet he could feel a subtle shift in the air, a heaviness that told him he was getting close. The smell changed too. It was no longer just the scent of damp earth and pine needles. It carried something older, something smoky, almost metallic, like rust left out in the rain. Ethan slowed his pace. When the lodge finally came into view, it rose out of the fog like a memory that should have stayed forgotten. Its roof sagged beneath years of rot, shingles blackened with moss, and the windows stared like hollow eyes. The place had been left for dead, but there was still a presence about it, an aura that made the rain feel colder the moment he saw it. The wood was warped, the front steps splintered, and the chimney leaned at a sharp angle. But faintly, barely visible, a thin gray thread of smoke was rising from it, blending into the rain. Ethan froze at the sight. No one was supposed to be here. No one lived at Ashwood Lodge. Yet the fire still burned. He walked closer, his breath shallow, his heart tightening with every step. The path leading up to the lodge was littered with broken branches, as though the forest itself had tried to keep people away. The closer he got, the louder the rain seemed, pounding against the roof, striking the ground like impatient fingers drumming. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled low, a warning from the sky itself. Ethan tried to push down the unease. He told himself there was a logical explanation. Maybe squatters had moved in, maybe campers had used the place for shelter. But deep down, he already knew it wasn't that simple. The porch creaked under his weight as he stepped onto it. The wood was soft, spongy, and it groaned as though resenting his presence. He paused at the front door, noticing the black iron handle streaked with rust. The door itself looked swollen with moisture, its paint peeled away long ago, but there was something strange about it. It bore deep scratches, claw-like gouges raked across the wood as though something had tried to force its way inside. Ethan ran his fingers across the grooves, his skin prickling at how sharp and deliberate they felt. The rain hammered down harder now, and the forest around him seemed to close in. The trees swayed like silent watchers, their shadows rippling across the clearing. He swallowed, took a breath, and gripped the handle. Cold shot through his hand instantly, a chill that sank into his bones. With effort, he pushed the door open. It moaned on its hinges, loud and pained, echoing into the hollow dark within. The lodge smelled of smoke and rot. The air was thick, heavy, damp with years of mildew, but beneath it was the undeniable scent of burning wood, fresh, recent, alive. Inside, the fireplace glowed faintly, its embers shifting as though someone had been here only moments ago. The flames flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the walls where deer heads and faded photographs still clung, warped by time. Every detail told Ethan one thing: the place had been left behind decades ago. And yet the fire in the hearth whispered otherwise. He stepped inside, the floor groaning in protest. The rain outside dulled into a muffled roar, and for the first time he realized how quiet it was inside the lodge. Too quiet. No birds, no wind slipping through the cracks, only the low hiss of the fire. Ethan felt the air grow colder around him, the kind of cold that seeps not from weather but from something unseen, something waiting. The silence pressed in on him until he could hear his own pulse thudding in his ears. He turned toward the staircase at the far end of the main hall. It was draped in cobwebs, its banister cracked, the steps coated with dust. And yet, there were footprints, muddy fresh, leading up. His throat tightened, his breath caught, and for the first time that day Ethan wondered if he had made a mistake coming here at all. Ethan stood frozen at the base of the staircase, staring at the muddy footprints. They trailed upward into the dark, vanishing into shadows that swallowed the top floor. The prints were fresh, sharp around the edges, as if whoever left them had walked through just moments before. The strange thing was there was only one set. No return tracks, no overlapping marks, just a solitary path leading into the unknown above. Ethan felt the hairs on his arms rise. The fire behind him hissed as another log cracked and collapsed, sending up a small flurry of sparks. The sound was too loud in the silence, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw something shift in the reflection of the glass over the mantel, something that wasn't him. He tore his eyes from the footprints and glanced around the main hall. The lodge was larger than he had imagined, though the years had not been kind. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing wood beneath that was warped and stained from water damage. Animal heads mounted along the walls stared with glassy eyes, their fur moth-eaten, their expressions frozen in silent snarls. A thick layer of dust covered nearly everything, yet the fireplace was alive, its flames dancing as if fed only minutes ago. Ethan crouched, brushing his hand across the edge of the hearth, and felt warmth that was too fresh, too deliberate. Someone was here. The storm outside grew louder. The rain slapped against the windows like restless fingers, and occasionally, lightning lit the trees outside in jagged silhouettes. Every time the flash came, the forest seemed to shift, like the trees had moved closer, bending in strange ways before the darkness swallowed them again. Ethan tried not to look too long. The forest itself felt alive, pressing against the lodge, listening. He turned his attention back to the footprints. His body told him to leave, to back away slowly and get out while he still could. But his mind pushed him forward. He had come too far to retreat. This place held secrets, and he felt them tugging at him, pulling him deeper like a tide. Swallowing his unease, he set one foot on the first step. The wood groaned beneath his weight, echoing into the empty hall. He paused, listening. Nothing. Only the crackle of the fire and the storm outside. Slowly he climbed higher. With each step the air grew colder. The scent of smoke faded, replaced by something damp and sour, like wet earth mixed with rust. The footprints gleamed faintly in the dim light, carrying him up the staircase until he reached the landing. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors, their paint peeling, their handles tarnished. Shadows bled from every corner, darker than they should have been, as though the rain outside couldn't quite reach them. Ethan knelt, examining the footprints more closely. They were heavy, deeper than normal, as if whoever made them had been carrying something, or as if their weight was unnatural. The shape bothered him too. They weren't boots, not exactly. They were bare, elongated, toes spread in a way that made his skin crawl. He rubbed his hands across his face, suddenly aware of how quiet it was again. Too quiet. The fire downstairs should have been audible even from here, but the silence stretched like a void, swallowing every sound. Then it came. A creak, faint but sharp, from farther down the hall. It wasn't him. Something had shifted up here. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat, every muscle tensing. The creak came again, followed by a low dragging sound, as though something heavy had brushed across the floorboards. It was distant, but it was moving, slowly, steadily, in his direction. Ethan's pulse quickened, and he pressed himself against the wall, straining his ears. The sound stopped. Nothing. Just silence again and the rain against the roof. He forced himself to take a step forward, his boots barely whispering against the wood. He passed the first door, its frame crooked, the hinges rusted. For a second he thought about pushing it open, but something in him screamed not to. He kept moving. Halfway down the hall, lightning flashed through a cracked window, illuminating everything in a brief, violent burst of white. In that instant Ethan saw it. At the far end of the corridor, something pale had been standing there. Tall, hunched, its head bent unnaturally low, arms too long, fingers grazing the floor. Its face had no features, just a smooth stretch of skin where eyes and a mouth should have been. And then the light vanished, plunging everything back into suffocating black. Ethan staggered back, his heart hammering. He blinked rapidly, trying to convince himself that the lightning had played tricks on him. His breathing was too loud now, harsh against the silence, and with every second that passed, he expected to hear the dragging sound return. He thought about running back down the stairs, but the thought of turning his back on that thing, whatever it was, felt worse. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He whispered into the dark. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, trembling, the words barely leaving his lips. The answer didn't come as a voice. It came as a breath. Cold, wet, exhaled against his ear from only inches away. Ethan jerked away instinctively, spinning on his heel, his shoulder crashing into the wall. His chest heaved, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes darted wildly across the hallway. There was nothing, no figure, no presence, just the hallway stretching empty in both directions. The pale form he thought he'd seen during the lightning flash was gone, as if it had never been there at all. But the breath, that sickeningly close whisper of air against his ear, had been real. He could still feel it lingering on his skin, damp and icy, as though something had leaned close to him in the dark. For a long moment he didn't move. His body was rigid, every muscle braced for the slightest hint of sound. The storm outside filled the silence, the rain tapping against the roof like fingers, the occasional thunder rolling across the forest. But nothing inside the lodge stirred. He was alone, or he was supposed to be. He forced himself to breathe slowly, pulling his hood back so his ears were uncovered, straining to catch even the faintest noise. That was when he noticed something strange. The storm outside wasn't as loud as it had been when he first entered. The rhythm of the rain sounded muffled, as though the walls of the lodge weren't just blocking it but swallowing it. Even the thunder seemed far away, muted, as if the sound had to push through something thicker than the air to reach him. The realization gnawed at him. This place wasn't normal. It wasn't just abandoned, it was wrong. The footprints on the floor still gleamed faintly with moisture, and he caught himself staring at them, following the trail again with his eyes. They didn't just go down the hallway, they stopped halfway, as though whoever made them had simply vanished. There were no marks leading into a room, no signs of turning back. Just an abrupt ending. The floorboards beyond were thick with undisturbed dust. Ethan crouched low, touching the last print. The mud was wet, still fresh. His mind raced. If the prints ended here, then either someone had cleaned them, which was impossible in the seconds he had been there, or they hadn't been made by someone walking normally at all. His stomach tightened as he imagined the figure he thought he'd seen. Maybe it hadn't been walking. Maybe it hadn't needed to. Ethan pushed himself upright, every step deliberate, careful not to let the floor creak. He approached the last door in the hallway, the one closest to where he had seen the pale figure. Its handle was tarnished black, and the wood of the frame was warped, swollen from years of water damage. He hesitated, reaching toward it, when a sound rippled through the silence. A faint scratching. Slow, deliberate, as if long fingernails were dragging across wood. It came from the other side of the door. He froze, his hand hovering inches from the handle. The sound grew louder, scraping in jagged lines, pausing, then starting again. His chest tightened, and for a moment he felt like a child again, standing in front of his bedroom closet late at night, certain something inside was waiting for him. His pulse thudded in his ears, his mouth dry. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by silence so thick it made him nauseous. And then, faintly, a knock. 3 dull thuds from the inside of the door. Not frantic, not random. Rhythmic. Intentional. Ethan staggered back, his shoulder brushing the opposite wall, his eyes wide. His instinct screamed at him to flee, to run back down the stairs and out into the rain, no matter what waited in the forest. But he didn't move. Something about the sound had pinned him in place, rooted him there like the trees outside. The doorknob rattled once, twice, then turned slowly with a long metallic groan. Ethan's breath caught as the door opened an inch. The dark inside was absolute, impenetrable even with the faint glow of lightning through the window. He stepped back again, but his eyes refused to leave the crack in the doorframe. Something moved in the black. He couldn't see it, not clearly, but the darkness shifted in a way it shouldn't have, bending unnaturally. The smell hit him then, damp earth and rot, sharp and metallic like iron left in the rain. His stomach lurched as he realized it was the same scent he had noticed earlier, the one that had clung to the footprints. The silence broke with a sound so quiet, so close, it nearly stopped his heart. A whisper, low and rasping, spoken from just inside the crack of the door. He couldn't make out the words. It was a wet, guttural murmur, but it was a voice. A voice where no one should have been. The door pushed open wider, an inch at a time, the hinges shrieking in protest. Ethan wanted to run, but his body betrayed him, locking him in place. The whisper came again, louder now, drawn-out syllables that made no sense but chilled him as if the meaning had been burned directly into his bones. The shadows shifted once more, and for a heartbeat he saw it. A pale hand, long-fingered, with nails that curved like claws, reaching out from the black. It gripped the door frame and the wood creaked under its strength. Slowly, impossibly slow, the rest of the shape began to emerge. Ethan stumbled backward, his boot catching on a loose floorboard. He fell hard against the wall, the sound echoing down the hallway. For the first time, his paralysis broke and he scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving. He didn't wait to see what would step out from the room. He ran, his boots pounding against the boards, the hall echoing with every frantic step. Behind him, the door slammed shut. The sound reverberated through the lodge, rattling the frames of the mounted heads, shaking dust from the ceiling. The storm outside surged, thunder cracking so loud it felt like the building itself had been split. Ethan staggered down the staircase, nearly losing his footing, and reached the bottom in a panicked blur. The fire was still burning in the hearth, glowing faintly, but the room no longer felt like a place of shelter. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows swaying in rhythm with his racing pulse. He stood there, gasping, staring at the fire, trying to calm himself, when he realized something that chilled him more than the breath in the hallway, more than the hand in the dark. The muddy footprints that had led upstairs, the ones that had stopped halfway down the corridor, were no longer there. The floorboards at the base of the stairs were clean, untouched, the dust unbroken, as though no one had ever walked them at all. And yet, from upstairs, he heard the slow creak of footsteps moving steadily across the floor. Ethan didn't dare move. He stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, his lungs straining to pull in air, every muscle quivering as the sound of footsteps echoed above him. They weren't rushed or frantic. They were slow, deliberate, the boards creaking in long, steady intervals as though someone, something, was pacing directly above the main hall. He tilted his head back, staring at the ceiling beams overhead, and felt the vibrations of the steps faintly trembling through the wood. The fire in the hearth hissed and cracked, sending sparks into the air, but even its glow felt wrong now, casting more shadow than light. The lodge didn't feel abandoned anymore, it felt occupied. He couldn't shake the sense that it had been waiting for him, that everything he'd experienced so far had been nothing more than the house taking its first slow breaths after being disturbed. He backed away from the staircase, his boots whispering against the warped floor. Each movement made the firelight shift across the mounted deer heads, their glassy eyes catching the glow in strange ways, as though they were watching him. A crack of thunder shook the windows, lightning bleaching the world outside for a split second, and Ethan thought he saw movement beyond the glass. The trees had bent unnaturally close again, their branches pressed against the window panes like skeletal hands clawing to get in. He blinked and they were still again, swaying only in the storm. Above him, the footsteps stopped. The silence pressed down on him harder than the sound ever had. Ethan's throat tightened, his body screaming for him to leave, to open the door and plunge back into the rain. But as he glanced at the front door, he noticed something strange. The handle was glistening wet, dripping as if rainwater had seeped through the cracks. He squinted. No, the door wasn't just wet. Water was trickling down its surface, thin streams of it running from the top to the bottom, pooling on the floor. He turned slowly, his gaze lifting upward and his stomach twisted. The ceiling directly above the door bulged downward, water dripping from it steadily, even though the storm outside wasn't strong enough to cause such flooding. The drips hit the floor with dull splashes, steady as a heartbeat. Ethan stepped back, unnerved, and as he did, he heard it again, the faint, deliberate creak of the upstairs floorboards. The steps resumed, slower than before, each one stretching out as if the thing above him wanted him to know it was there. Ethan forced himself to turn away from the door. His eyes swept across the room, searching for something, anything that would make sense of the nightmare unfolding. That was when he noticed the walls. The photographs, faded black and white pictures in crooked frames, seemed to have shifted. He could have sworn they'd been warped beyond recognition before, the faces distorted by age and water damage. But now the figures inside them were clearer. Families in stiff poses, children with hollow expressions, hunters holding rifles, their eyes sharp and too direct. Every one of them seemed to stare at Ethan, their gazes following him no matter where he stood. The fire popped loudly, a log collapsing into ash, and Ethan flinched. He glanced back at the staircase. The air above shimmered faintly, as though the space at the top of the stairs were warped by heat, though there was no warmth there. His breath clouded in front of him, white in the cold. Something was watching him from that unseen vantage point, just out of sight. He forced himself to speak, his voice cracking. "I know someone's here." The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. The footsteps above stopped again. The silence deepened, heavier than before, like the whole lodge was holding its breath. And then, faint but distinct, a sound drifted down. A low, wet chuckle. Not human. Not entirely. Ethan stumbled backward, his spine pressing against the mantle of the fireplace. He reached down instinctively, his hand brushing across a piece of iron resting on the stone hearth, a fire poker. He grabbed it, gripping it so tightly his knuckles whitened. It wasn't much, but it was something solid in a place that felt like it was unraveling. The silence stretched on, and for a moment he dared to hope that whatever was up there would stay hidden. But then, slowly, something began descending the staircase. The sound was deliberate, wood bending, nails groaning under weight. He fixed his eyes on the stairs, and in the firelight he saw it, the faintest outline of something pale gripping the banister. Its fingers curled too long, wrapping around the wood like roots twisting into soil. He tightened his grip on the poker, his chest pounding, his body vibrating with fear. The figure moved lower, one step at a time, its shape revealed in pieces by the firelight. First the hand, then the arm, long and impossibly thin. The air grew colder still, so cold his teeth chattered. By the time the figure reached the midway point, Ethan could no longer convince himself that this was human. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the figure stopped. It lingered halfway down the staircase, still cloaked in shadow, as though it wanted to be seen but not fully revealed. The silence became unbearable. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears, his breath shallow and ragged. And then from the darkness came the sound again, the same low, rasping whisper he'd heard upstairs. Only this time the words were clearer. Still distorted, still guttural, but unmistakably directed at him. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan's grip tightened on the poker, his hands slick with sweat despite the cold. He wanted to run, to flee into the storm, but his body betrayed him again, locking him in place. The fire flickered violently, shadows clawing up the walls, and for the first time Ethan realized that the fire wasn't burning wood anymore. It was burning something blackened, cracked, and unmistakably human. Ethan couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the hearth, on the fire that had once been a simple comfort but was now an abomination. Flames licked upward, feeding hungrily on the blackened remains that weren't logs at all. The shapes were too irregular, too deliberate. He saw the curve of a rib, the bend of a joint, a hand curled in ash. The sight was so wrong, so impossible, that his mind fought to reject it. And yet the fire burned on, crackling cheerfully as though mocking his horror. His throat tightened. His stomach churned violently, and he turned away, gagging, the poker trembling in his grip. He wanted to run, to tear the front door open and hurl himself into the rain, to put as much distance between himself and this cursed place as possible. But the sound on the staircase anchored him. That whisper, the words, echoed in his mind like a splinter that couldn't be pulled free. "You shouldn't have come here." The figure remained halfway down the stairs, shrouded in darkness, its pale hand still gripping the banister. Ethan could see only glimpses of it. A long arm, a sliver of shoulder, the hint of a head bent at a strange angle. The firelight flickered across its form, but never revealed it fully, as if the shadows themselves conspired to hide it. He squinted, trying to make out more, but every time the flames brightened, the darkness deepened to match, ensuring he saw only fragments. The silence in the room became unbearable again. The storm outside raged, the windows rattling in their frames, yet the sound seemed distant, muted, swallowed before it could reach him. The lodge was a void, and inside it he felt utterly alone, except for the thing on the stairs. His fingers flexed around the poker. The thought came unbidden. If he rushed the figure, if he swung with all his strength, maybe he could drive it back, maybe he could break free. But the moment he considered it, he felt something shift in the air. The figure hadn't moved, but the space around him seemed to tighten, pressing down on his chest like invisible hands. It was as though the lodge itself had heard his thought and was daring him to try. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing his voice through his trembling throat. "What do you want?" The answer didn't come from the stairs. It came from behind him. A whisper so close it tickled the hairs at the back of his neck. "We already have what we want." He spun, swinging the poker wildly, the tip whistling through the air. Nothing. No one. Only the fire snapping and the shadows dancing along the walls. His breath came ragged, loud in the silence, and he staggered backward until he nearly tripped over the rug in the center of the hall. He steadied himself, his eyes darting between the fire, the door, and the staircase. When he turned back to the stairs, the figure was gone. Ethan's chest clenched. His eyes scanned the shadows frantically, but the staircase stood empty, the banister bare. The air, however, was not lighter. It was heavier, more suffocating, as though the figure had not disappeared but simply spread itself into the room, everywhere at once. The mounted deer heads seemed to grin wider, their teeth bared unnaturally, their glassy eyes catching the firelight in ways they hadn't before. The photographs on the walls blurred, the faces inside them distorting, melting into expressions of silent screams. The poker shook in his grip. He knew he had to move, to do something, anything. Standing still was a death sentence. He glanced at the front door again, the wet wood still dripping as though the storm outside had forced its way in. He took a cautious step toward it, his boots heavy against the creaking floor. Another. He reached the threshold, his hand outstretched toward the handle. Cold surged through his palm before he even touched it. He gasped and pulled back, staring at the handle as frost spread across it in delicate veins, crawling over the iron like a living thing. The water dripping from the door began to freeze mid-fall, droplets hanging in the air before crystallizing. The storm outside was still rain, but here the door was becoming entombed in ice. A sound broke through the silence, soft but unmistakable, the creak of weight settling onto the floor behind him. Slow, steady. The sound of footsteps approaching across the boards of the hall. Ethan turned his head slowly, his breath caught, every nerve screaming for him not to look. And yet he did. The staircase was empty. The fire burned. The shadows swayed. But the footsteps were still coming. Closer, closer. The air grew colder with every step, his breath fogging thickly in front of him. He staggered back toward the center of the hall, the poker raised, his eyes darting wildly. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. The space around him warped, heavy with presence, as though unseen eyes pressed into his skin. Then, for the first time, the sound came not from the floorboards but from the rug beneath him. A single creak, impossible, from fabric that shouldn't make such a noise. He froze, looking down. The rug bulged upward, a slow swell, as if something beneath the floor was pressing against it. The bulge moved, crawling across the rug, circling him, the boards underneath groaning with strain. His chest seized, and he stepped back quickly, his boots slipping against the warped wood. And then it stopped. The rug fell flat again. The silence returned. Ethan stood trembling, his arms heavy, his breath ragged. He waited, every second stretched thin as a wire. Nothing moved. Nothing came. For a moment he thought maybe, just maybe, it had gone. Then the fire went out. The room was thrown into darkness, the faint light of the storm outside spilling through the windows in broken flashes. In that brief strobe of lightning, Ethan saw everything at once. The pale figure standing inches from him, its face a blank canvas of stretched skin, its body bent and twitching in unnatural angles. Its arms hung too low, fingers grazing the floor, claws gleaming faintly. And worst of all, its head turned toward him though it had no eyes, and somehow he knew it was smiling. The thunder rolled, the light died, and he was swallowed by black. Ethan stood frozen at the threshold of the dining hall, the sound of the rain outside still pounding like an endless drumbeat against the roof, but in here it was strangely muted, almost distant, as if the walls of the lodge were swallowing sound rather than blocking it. The fireplace at the far end of the room hissed and crackled, the flames unusually tall for a fire that seemed unattended. The light wasn't warm, it was flickering, weak, a sickly glow that painted the wooden walls in tones of orange and black, stretching the shadows into shapes that never seemed to hold still. Every time Ethan blinked, the silhouettes looked different, like they had shifted a fraction to the side or grown longer, reaching toward him. The long table in the center of the room looked as though it had once hosted large gatherings. Its surface was scarred with knife marks and burns, the varnish worn down to raw wood in places. Plates and glasses still sat there, though dulled with grime and thick with dust. What caught Ethan's attention most, however, was that several of the plates weren't empty. Cracked ceramic bowls still held what looked like soup, though the liquid inside had long since congealed into a dark, tar-like residue. Forks rested at awkward angles, and chairs were pulled back unevenly, some tipped over completely. It was as though a dinner had been abandoned all at once. Sudden, hurried, no one bothering to clean up. The sight of it all made Ethan's chest feel heavy, his mind pressing with unasked questions. Who had been here? What had made them leave in such a hurry? And why did the fire still burn? He stepped closer, the floorboards beneath him groaning and shifting like they had grown tired of holding weight after so many years. Each step echoed in the hollow room, and each echo seemed to last a little too long, fading only when he had already taken another step. He told himself it was just the acoustics of the lodge, but deep down, it unsettled him. He reached the edge of the table and rested his hand on one of the chairs. The wood felt damp, swollen with the endless rain that seemed to seep into everything here. A faint chill lingered on the chair's backrest, as though someone had only recently vacated it. Then the fire popped loudly, a sharp crack that snapped through the silence and made Ethan flinch. He turned toward it and froze. The flames had grown higher, licking the stone of the hearth, but there was no fresh wood inside to feed it. He could see the logs, blackened, brittle, breaking down into glowing embers, but somehow the fire burned stronger than it had moments before. Its light brightened the room, but not in a comforting way. The glow revealed more of the walls, more of the shapes that shifted just out of focus, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the fire wasn't giving warmth at all. It was feeding on something else, something unseen, and it was alive because of it. The sound of rain pressed closer, as though the storm outside had moved directly against the walls of the lodge. Wind groaned through the cracks, carrying faint whispers, so faint he almost dismissed them as tricks of his imagination. But when he stood still, straining to listen, the whispers seemed to form words. They weren't clear, muffled as though spoken from beneath water, but he thought he caught fragments. His name drawn out like a breath, and something else, lower, a growl threaded between syllables. Ethan's skin prickled, the hair on his arms lifting. His first instinct was to leave the dining room, to back away and return to the front door, to leave the lodge altogether and take his chances with the rain. But his eyes were fixed on the fire, and in that light he thought he saw movement. For a moment, in the heart of the flames, he swore he saw the outline of a figure, just a shadow, featureless, standing upright in the fire as if it belonged there. It tilted its head slowly, and though it had no face, Ethan felt the weight of its gaze settle directly on him. He blinked and the image was gone. The fire hissed again, collapsing slightly, but still burning stronger than any natural flame should. He backed away from the table, his steps careful, his eyes darting to the corners of the room. The shadows clung to the walls, too thick, too alive. When he reached the doorway, he nearly stumbled into the hall, desperate to put distance between himself and that impossible fire. The lodge felt heavier now, every breath thick with damp smoke and mildew. The whispers still lingered, echoing faintly, not from the fire this time, but from deeper within the building, somewhere above him, drifting from the direction of the staircase. Ethan turned slowly toward the stairs, his stomach twisting. The muddy footprints he had seen earlier were still there, clear and fresh, leading upward. The sight of them now filled him with dread rather than curiosity. Someone, or something, was in the lodge with him. He tightened his grip on the strap of his backpack, the small comfort of weight against his shoulder grounding him for a moment. He thought about leaving, about running out into the rain and never looking back, but something in him wouldn't let him. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was something the lodge itself pressed into him, a pull that whispered, "You came here for answers and you will not leave without them." With a deep breath, Ethan stepped toward the stairs. The lodge groaned in reply as though acknowledging him, the sound rising through the walls like a warning or a greeting. The fire hissed once more behind him and then fell quiet, leaving the sound of rain and whispers to guide him upward. The staircase loomed before Ethan like the spine of some great sleeping creature, its banister slick with dust and webs, its steps darkened with years of damp rot. Each footprint in the mud climbed upward, clear and recent, the edges of the tracks sharp as though pressed into the wood only moments ago. Ethan's pulse quickened as he stared at them. There was no denying it anymore. Someone else was here. Or something. The storm outside seemed to grow heavier as he stood at the foot of the stairs, the sound of rain like an ocean crashing against the roof, pressing closer, pressing harder, as though the forest itself wanted to shove him inside and force him to climb. Thunder rolled across the sky in deep, rumbling waves, and the windows rattled faintly in their frames. For a brief moment, when the lightning flashed, the staircase seemed to shiver, shadows shifting up its length like black water running uphill. Ethan blinked hard, telling himself it was a trick of the light, but the air in his chest grew tight, his breath shallow. He put one foot on the first step. It sagged beneath him, groaning like an old man's voice, and a puff of dust rose into the air. He paused, waiting for the echo to fade, but the sound carried strangely, up the stairs into the unseen rooms above, like the creak itself had been swallowed by something listening. His hand hovered over the banister, hesitating, but eventually gripped the wood. It was cold, unnaturally so, as though it had been lying in a grave of ice. With another deep breath, Ethan climbed. Each step was slow, deliberate, his ears straining for the slightest noise beyond his own. Halfway up, he could hear it, faint, steady, like breathing. Not his. Not from his chest. It came from above, carried through the walls, soft but unmistakable. The sound rose and fell in rhythm, deep and slow, as though the very lodge inhaled and exhaled. With every breath it took, the walls seemed to shift, creaking with the effort, and Ethan's heart hammered harder. He wanted to stop, to retreat back to the front door, but the same pull that had carried him into the dining room and toward the fire now tugged him up the stairs. By the time he reached the landing, the air had changed. The smell of smoke and rot was thicker here, cut with something sharp and metallic, iron, rust, blood. The hallway stretched out in both directions, a tunnel of darkness lined with doors. The floor beneath his boots groaned with each step, and each groan echoed as though the hallway was much larger than it appeared. Shadows clung to the ceiling, sagging low, shifting like curtains of black fog. Ethan turned left first, following the prints. They trailed down the hallway in an uneven path, stopping suddenly outside a closed door. The wood was swollen from years of rain and neglect, but something about this door felt different. The mud on the floor stopped directly in front of it, as though whoever left the tracks had stood here for some time before entering. Ethan reached for the handle, then froze. It wasn't rusted. It gleamed faintly in the dim light, slick and wet, as though someone's hand had been on it only moments before. His pulse pounded as he leaned closer. For an instant, he thought he heard something from the other side, a faint scratching sound like fingernails dragging slowly down wood. The sound crawled into his ears, soft at first but growing sharper, dragging deeper, as though clawing toward him through the very door. Ethan pulled his hand back, fighting the urge to retreat. The storm chose that moment to crash again, thunder booming so loud the floor seemed to tremble. Lightning spilled briefly through a crack in the roof, and in that flash of white light, Ethan saw something impossible. The door breathed. The wood swelled outward slightly, like lungs filling with air, then sank back in as though exhaling. When the light faded, the door looked still again, but Ethan's eyes burned from what he had seen. He backed away a step, chest tightening, but the lodge would not let him leave. A new sound came now from behind him at the far end of the hallway. A slow, deliberate creak of another door opening on its own. He spun around, heart in his throat, staring into the dark stretch of the hall. One of the doors had cracked open, a thin sliver of blackness between its frame. The breath he'd been holding left his chest in a shudder. Every instinct screamed at him not to go closer, not to look, but the silence after the creak was worse than noise. The air was waiting, holding its breath with him. Ethan took a step forward, then another, the shadows thickening as though trying to close around him. When he reached the half-open door, he hesitated only a second before pushing it further. The hinges whined, and the smell of mildew and wet earth poured out. He stepped inside. The room was a bedroom, but only in shape. The bed frame sagged against one wall, its mattress long rotted, but something had disturbed the dust here too. Footprints, not muddy like the ones in the hall, but clear depressions in the dust, circling the room back and forth, pacing. The prints ended at the far corner, but there was nothing there. Just peeling wallpaper, a broken chair, and shadows that clung too thick to the wall. Ethan stared, waiting, listening. The pacing prints told him what he didn't want to admit. Something had been trapped in here. Something had worn a path into the floor, restless, waiting. His throat was dry, his chest tight, and just as he turned to leave, he heard it again. That same slow, steady breathing, only this time it was closer. Right behind him. Ethan's skin crawled as the sound filled the room, slow, measured inhalations followed by heavy, drawn-out exhalations. It wasn't his own breathing, though his chest rose and fell too quickly, too shallow, trying to match the rhythm without realizing it. This was deeper, heavier, like lungs that had been breathing far longer than any human should. The sound came from just behind him, low enough that he could almost feel the warmth brushing the back of his neck. His body locked, muscles refusing to obey the command to turn. He could see the faded wallpaper in front of him trembling slightly, as if the very air in the room shivered with each breath. His hands clenched at his sides, damp with sweat, trembling faintly as he forced himself to pivot just an inch at a time. The room was empty. The footprints in the dust were still there, circling endlessly, but the corner behind him showed nothing but shadow. The broken chair slouched against the wall, its backrest snapped in two. The air, however, still carried the sound. Still breathing. Still close. Ethan's mouth was dry as sand, and when he whispered, the word barely broke into the silence. "Hello?" His voice cracked, the single word sounding too loud, too sharp against the stillness. The breathing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse. It stretched out, tense and waiting, until his ears rang with it. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum, loud enough he feared it would drown out the next sound entirely. Then, slowly, as if mocking him, the breathing began again, but this time from the opposite side of the room, as though whatever was there had crossed the space in a blink, without footsteps, without movement. Ethan's body moved before his brain caught up, and he stumbled backward, out through the doorframe, colliding with the hallway wall. The old wood shuddered under the impact, dust raining down from the ceiling. His shoulder ached from the collision, but fear drove him on. He staggered into the hallway, the door swinging shut behind him with a hollow thud, sealing the room like a tomb. The breathing stopped. He pressed against the wall, chest heaving, staring at the closed door. The knob glistened faintly, wet with condensation or sweat. He couldn't tell. The hallway around him was darker than before, the storm outside muffled now, as though the house had wrapped itself in silence, muting the world beyond. He wanted to run, to throw himself down the stairs and out into the rain, but every time he tried to picture the forest outside, he saw nothing but fog and trees that seemed to move on their own. The idea of leaving suddenly felt just as terrifying as staying. He forced his feet to move, following the hallway further. Each step was unsteady, each floorboard groaning like it carried not just his weight but something pressing down from above. More doors lined the hall, some closed, others cracked open, their black interiors like open mouths. He tried not to look too closely, afraid of what might be peering back through the darkness. At the far end, the footprints in the mud appeared again, continuing their trail. They led to another door, slightly ajar, the light of the storm flickering faintly through a window beyond. Ethan swallowed hard, the pull inside him stronger now. Something in that room wanted him to come closer. He tried to fight it, to turn away, but his feet carried him forward like a marionette tugged on unseen strings. He reached the door and pushed it open with trembling hands. The room beyond was another bedroom, but this one was larger, with a wide window looking out into the storm. Rain lashed against the glass, streaking it in silver lines, lightning flashing in erratic bursts that illuminated the room in stark white. The bed here was intact but sunken, the sheets still tangled as if someone had left it in haste. At the foot of the bed sat something that stopped Ethan's breath. A chair facing the window. And in that chair, the faint silhouette of a figure. He froze, the hair on his arms standing rigid. The figure wasn't clear, not fully solid. It wavered, like smoke rising in still air, its shape trembling faintly. Lightning struck again outside, and for the briefest instant, Ethan saw its head tilt, just slightly, as though acknowledging him. When the thunder rolled, the chair was empty. The rain hammered louder against the window, drowning the silence, but Ethan's mind filled with its own storm. He stared at the chair, empty now but still facing outward, its wooden arms worn and splintered from use. The seat was indented, the cushion sagging as though something heavy had only just risen from it. He stepped forward, one hand reaching out toward the chair, though he didn't know why. His fingers brushed the worn wood and he pulled back instantly. It was warm. Not just warm, but pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat. The whispers began again, faint at first, threading through the hiss of rain, winding through the walls. They rose in waves, overlapping, dozens of voices murmuring too quietly to understand. Ethan spun, trying to locate the source, but it was everywhere, bleeding from the floor, the ceiling, even the glass of the window. Lightning flashed again, and for a heartbeat the reflection in the glass was not his own. Another shape stood behind him in the reflection, tall and faceless, leaning close. He turned sharply, but the room was empty. The whispers surged louder, words forming now, repeating in overlapping layers. Stay, stay, stay. Ethan's throat tightened. His hand gripped the strap of his pack again, holding it like an anchor, forcing himself not to run, not to scream. The storm outside was unrelenting, the walls of the lodge closing in, and the fire in the downstairs hall hissed like it had grown stronger, its glow bleeding faintly up the staircase. Whatever was in this place wanted him here, and now it was speaking to him. And somewhere, in the depths of the lodge, something else shifted. Heavy, deliberate, the sound of movement too real to ignore. Ethan backed away from the chair, his breath shallow, his skin clammy as the last echo of the whispers bled into silence. The storm outside raged on, lashing the glass with sheets of rain, but it felt strangely far away, as if the walls of the lodge had swallowed the storm and left him inside something quieter, heavier, more alive. His eyes darted between the window, the empty chair, and the corners of the room where the shadows seemed to shiver like living things. He forced himself into the hallway again, heart pounding in his ears. The footprints on the warped floorboards no longer followed a single trail. They branched, diverging into different directions. Muddy impressions smudged by something dragging, as if several figures had walked here at once or one had staggered in circles, confused, restless. The sight of them made his stomach knot. There was no logic anymore, no pattern he could trust. The hall stretched longer than before, impossibly so, as though each time he blinked, more doors had appeared, more stretches of shadowed wood extending ahead. He whispered to himself without realizing, "It's just the house. It's just the house." His own voice came back warped, muffled by the air, repeating in a tone that didn't sound entirely his own. One of the doors to his right groaned open slightly as he passed, hinges straining as though pulled by invisible fingers. A strip of darkness leaked into the hallway, thicker than shadow, like smoke but unmoving. Ethan kept his eyes straight, refusing to look inside. He knew if he did, something would be staring back. The whispers returned, louder now, threading through the walls like veins. They no longer came in one voice but many, men, women, even children, overlapping, chanting words he couldn't make out. Their rhythm rose and fell like the tide, growing sharp, then soft, then sharp again, until Ethan realized with a jolt that they matched his heartbeat. Each pulse in his chest was echoed by their hissed chorus, pulling him forward, deeper into the hall. He reached another door, wider than the rest, its surface warped and carved with strange grooves. Unlike the other rooms, this one wasn't partially open. It was firmly shut, but light seeped from beneath the threshold, faint and flickering as if a fire burned inside. Ethan froze, remembering the hearth downstairs, the way the flames had stretched unnaturally high. His hand twitched at his side, reluctant, but something about the door tugged at him, stronger than fear, stronger than reason. The whispers hushed all at once, as though holding their breath. The silence pressed so hard against his ears that it hurt. Ethan reached for the handle, his fingers trembling, and when they brushed the metal he flinched. It was hot, searing as if it had been left in a furnace. He jerked his hand back, the smell of singed skin rising faintly in the air though no mark appeared. Then came the sound. From inside the room, a dragging noise began, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It moved closer to the door, inch by inch, the rhythm uneven, broken by wet thuds. Ethan stumbled back, his breath quickening, eyes locked on the sliver of light beneath the door. The glow dimmed, flickered, and then, just as the dragging reached the other side, the light went out. The hallway plunged into near darkness, lit only by the faint flashes of lightning through the far window. Ethan's throat tightened, and before he could move, the door shuddered. Something on the other side pressed against it hard, once, twice, the wood straining under the force. Then silence again. He turned sharply, backing away, his footsteps quick and uneven. His shoulder brushed the wall, and it felt alive beneath his palm, pulsing faintly, damp and warm, as though veins ran through the lodge itself. He yanked his hand away with a shudder, wiping it on his jeans, but the sensation lingered, like something had clung to his skin. At the far end of the hall, the staircase waited, descending back into the main floor. For a moment he thought of running back down, of leaving the second floor behind, but when his eyes flicked to the landing, he froze. The faint orange glow of the fire from below had grown brighter, bleeding up the stairs like the lodge itself was burning. Shadows writhed along the wall, stretching up toward him like grasping hands. Behind him, one of the doors slammed shut. The sound rattled through the hall like a gunshot, and in its wake the whispers surged louder than ever, rising into a frantic chorus. The walls trembled, dust raining from the ceiling, and Ethan covered his ears instinctively. It didn't matter. The voices were inside, pressing against his skull, whispering stay over and over in 1,000 overlapping tones. Lightning flashed again, and in that burst of light he saw them, figures standing in the hall. Not solid, not whole, but outlines, smudged like smoke given shape. They lined the walls on both sides, unmoving, featureless, their heads all tilted toward him. By the time the thunder rolled, they were gone. Ethan staggered forward, desperate now, his only thought to get out of the hall before the darkness swallowed him whole. The walls creaked, the floor buckled under his steps, and somewhere behind him, the dragging sound returned, closer than before, following. He didn't look back. Ethan's boots pounded softly against the warped floorboards, each step echoing into the darkness as the hall seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The storm outside roared louder, hammering rain against the roof, but inside the lodge, the sound felt muted, distant, as though the building itself had swallowed the world beyond its walls. Every shadow seemed to twitch at the edges of his vision, shapes bending and stretching with every flicker of lightning through the distant windows. The whispers followed him, faint at first, curling along the walls, threading into his ears like smoke. Then they grew louder, layering over one another, voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of men, women, children, some angry, some sad, some laughing in tones so hollow it made his stomach churn. Every step Ethan took seemed to draw the voices closer, pushing him forward, deeper into the lodge, like it was guiding him into the heart of its nightmare. The hallway ahead split into two corridors, each darker than the last. Muddy footprints led down both, but Ethan's eyes were drawn instinctively to the left. The doorways along that path were warped, their frames twisted like they had been pried open by unseen hands, but none were completely ajar. The closer he walked, the more the shadows shifted, pooling in the corners, pressing against the walls. He couldn't tell if the shapes belonged to the shadows themselves or if they were watching him from just beyond the dim light. As he moved forward, he noticed the walls changing. Faded photographs lined the corridor, frames crooked and glass cracked. In some, faces had begun to distort, mouths stretching too wide, eyes black and hollow, staring directly at him even though he hadn't looked directly at them before. One of the photographs flickered in the lightning. A family posed stiffly, a man, woman, and 2 children, but for an instant the children's heads turned to follow him. A chill ran down Ethan's spine as he realized it wasn't just the photographs. Every shadow along the hallway seemed to hold something alive within it. A door at the end of the corridor creaked open slowly, though no wind could have moved it. Ethan froze, listening. From inside came a faint, scraping noise, like metal being dragged over wood. The sound was irregular, uneven, stopping and starting in time with his pulse. The fire below hissed faintly, sending an orange glow upward, but the corridor remained cloaked in darkness. Every nerve in his body screamed to turn and run, to abandon the second floor altogether, but the whispers had grown insistent now, overlapping into a single thread, repeating the same word again and again. See. Ethan swallowed, trying to force himself to keep moving. Each step he took was heavy, like the floorboards themselves were pressing against his feet, dragging him into the corridor. The air was damp and thick, carrying the metallic tang of something rotting, the faintest hint of iron under the scent of wet wood and mildew. As he reached the half-open door, the light spilling from inside flickered strangely, shadows writhing within, twisting as if alive. Then the dragging sound returned, closer than before. It wasn't coming from inside the room this time, it was all around him, pressing from the walls themselves, echoing through the ceiling, vibrating in the floor. His skin prickled, and his breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. He wanted to run, to flee back the way he came, but the hall behind him now seemed to stretch farther than before, stretching endlessly, lined with more doors and more shadows that pulsed in rhythm with the whispers. Ethan's hand gripped the strap of his backpack, grounding himself as best he could. He leaned forward, pushing open the door. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center, facing the far wall. The floorboards around it were scratched and worn, like something heavy had been dragged across them repeatedly. The faint orange glow from below illuminated it partially, revealing that the chair was not quite empty. Something crouched there, featureless yet vaguely humanoid. Its head was too large, bending slightly at an unnatural angle, and its limbs were long and thin, bending in ways human bones should not. Ethan's stomach clenched as he realized it wasn't just crouching. It was breathing, slowly, deliberately, each inhale drawing in the very air around him, and each exhale seeming to push shadows into the corners of the room. Lightning flashed, and for an instant Ethan saw the chair full of pale, writhing shapes, like smoke with eyes, moving together in a single mass. The thunder rolled immediately after, and the light disappeared. When the room went dark again, the chair was empty, but the shadows had shifted, pooling closer to him now, crawling along the walls like living water. Ethan stumbled back, heart hammering, every muscle trembling. The whispers surged again, overlapping, louder, almost deafening, repeating. His eyes darted to the far wall. A photograph hung crookedly, a single man in a hunting pose, rifle in hand. For a split second, the man's eyes moved. They followed Ethan as he shifted, tilting with him, blinking faintly in the dim light. Then another flash of lightning illuminated the hallway outside, and for the first time Ethan saw them. Dozens of pale, faceless figures standing just beyond the doorway in the hall, stretching down the corridor he had just walked. Their bodies swayed slightly, their limbs bending in impossible angles, their heads tilting to watch him. He stumbled backward, tripping over a floorboard, his backpack striking the chair. The scraping noise roared suddenly, deafening, as if every shadow in the lodge had come to life, dragging itself toward him at once. The whispers became screams, 1,000 voices shouting, crying, mocking him in unison. The air itself seemed to vibrate with it, pressing into his chest, stealing his breath. Ethan's mind screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted, trapped by some invisible force. The fire below hissed louder, sending another wave of orange light up the stairs, illuminating the faces in the photographs along the hallway. Each one twisted, morphing into expressions of anguish and hunger. The walls themselves seemed to pulse, breathe, leaning closer, as though the lodge itself wanted to devour him. And then, from the far end of the corridor, a single figure stepped forward. Not from the shadows, not from the photographs, not from the floorboards, but from thin air, materializing in the hallway like a ripple in reality. Its limbs were elongated, its head tilted, its face featureless. But the moment it moved, Ethan felt it in his chest, a pressure that stole his breath. It advanced slowly, deliberately, dragging the shadows with it, the whispers now concentrated into one guttural, distorted voice that spoke directly into his mind. "You cannot leave." Ethan stumbled backward again, tripping over the warped floorboards, scraping his palms against the rough wood. He forced himself to rise, grip tightening on his backpack strap, and slowly, trembling, he took another step forward. The figure paused, tilting its head, the shadows pooling behind it like smoke curling upward. Every step Ethan took seemed to make the lodge alive. Walls groaning, floorboards trembling, whispers echoing. The hallway stretched endlessly now, and he could see more figures, just barely visible in the dim orange glow from the fire below, swaying, crawling, watching. Each one's limbs bent impossibly, each one faceless, breathing in unison, pushing him forward, deeper into the lodge, towards something he couldn't yet see. Ethan's chest heaved, his mind screaming, but he moved, because he knew stopping meant succumbing. Each step drew him closer to the end of the corridor, closer to the source of the shadows, closer to whatever was orchestrating the lodge's horrors. And all around him, the whispers and the fire and the storm converged, wrapping the hallway in a living nightmare that had waited for him long before he had ever crossed the threshold. Ethan's legs trembled as he stumbled down the corridor, each step heavier than the last. The warped floorboards groaned under his weight, and the walls seemed to pulse with some unseen heartbeat, alive in the faint, flickering glow that bled upward from the fire below. The whispers had coalesced into a single voice now, low, guttural, and distorted, echoing inside his skull. "You cannot leave." The figures were closer now. Pale, faceless, impossibly thin, their limbs bending in ways that made his stomach twist. They moved slowly, gliding rather than walking, their elongated arms reaching outward, shadows trailing behind them like liquid darkness. Every movement of theirs caused the walls to groan, dust to fall from the ceiling, and the air to thicken with the coppery tang of iron. Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to run, but the hallway stretched endlessly, the staircase behind him swallowed by shadow. The walls seemed to bend, elongating the corridor, and the doors along it warped as though the building itself was reshaping to trap him. His boots scuffed against the floor, leaving faint imprints that vanished almost immediately, swallowed by the darkness that pooled along the baseboards. Lightning flashed outside the window at the far end of the hall, illuminating the figures for a split second. In that brief light, he could see dozens of them, standing silently along the walls, their heads tilted in unison toward him. They didn't blink, didn't speak, they just watched, moving in tandem like puppets on invisible strings. Every hair on his body stood on end, and he could feel the pressure of their gaze pressing against him, pushing him forward toward the room at the corridor's end. The whispers surged, louder, layered, overlapping into 1,000 voices. He could no longer make out words. They were no longer words but pure sound, crawling into his skull, gnawing at his thoughts. The metallic scent of blood and wet earth was stronger now, thick in the air, clinging to his throat and making it hard to swallow. Ethan pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it, but the sound was inside him, vibrating through his bones. Ahead, the door waited. Wider than the others, carved with strange grooves and symbols that seemed to writhe when he looked too long. The light from the room beyond spilled out, orange and flickering like firelight, but the glow didn't warm. It seemed to pull the shadows forward, elongating them, making the figures in the hallway grow taller, more grotesque, leaning toward him like predators circling prey. Ethan forced himself to keep moving. His legs burned, knees threatening to buckle, but the pull was irresistible. The whispers now whispered directly into his mind. "Come, see, face what waits." The first figure reached for him. Its arms stretched impossibly long, its fingers thin, black as smoke, and for a heartbeat, Ethan thought it would touch him. He stumbled, tripping over the warped floorboards, falling to one knee. The shadow recoiled slightly, then advanced again, dragging its elongated limbs across the floor without sound, a silent predator gliding toward him. Ethan scrambled to his feet, heart hammering, chest heaving. The hallway seemed to close in, the walls bending inward, shadows pooling and rising like liquid ink. He could hear the faintest dragging now, footsteps that weren't his, moving alongside him, circling him, keeping pace no matter which way he turned. The door at the end of the corridor was closer now, impossibly so. He reached for the handle, but before he could touch it, a figure materialized directly in front of him. Taller than any man, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, faceless, limbs bending like wire. The air around it shimmered with cold, a draft that smelled faintly of decay. Its presence was suffocating, pressing down on him, and the whispers became screams. "Stay, face, forever." Ethan stumbled back, slamming into the wall. The figure followed, gliding silently, reaching for him again. He could feel its proximity, a cold pressure at the back of his neck, like icy fingers brushing the nape of his spine. Panic surged, and he yanked the door handle with both hands, the metal slick with sweat. The door swung open slowly, creaking like it hadn't been used in decades, revealing the room beyond bathed in flickering firelight. Inside, the space was larger than it should have been, stretching farther than the lodge's exterior suggested. The floor sagged in places, warped and uneven, and shadows pooled thickly in the corners, crawling along the walls. In the center of the room stood another figure, taller and darker than the one in the hallway. Its presence seemed to absorb the light, drawing the flickering orange glow from the fire below into itself, leaving everything else in deeper shadow. Ethan stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud, reverberating through the lodge like a gunshot. The hallway outside went silent instantly, the whispers cut off abruptly. He pressed his back against the door, chest heaving, staring at the figure in the center of the room. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply waited. The air in the room was thick, heavy, as if the building itself had drawn a breath and held it, waiting for him to make the next move. The firelight danced across its form, revealing limbs too long, joints bent at impossible angles, and a featureless face that seemed to shimmer faintly, as though it couldn't decide whether to exist fully or remain a shadow. The whispers returned, inside his head now, not outside. "Look, see, understand." The pressure in his chest increased, making it hard to breathe. He realized he couldn't tear his gaze away from the figure, couldn't move. It was pulling him in, demanding acknowledgement, and the shadows in the room shifted toward him, crawling across the floor like liquid night. A low, metallic rasp came from the figure, the first sound it had made, like nails scraping stone. The room seemed to pulse with it, the floor vibrating under Ethan's feet. The pressure intensified, shadows pushing closer, curling around him, and the whispers became a single, distorted voice. "Face it, or be lost." Ethan's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, unable to look away. The figure advanced slowly, deliberately, each step silent, its presence a weight pressing into his mind. The firelight danced across its form, elongating it, twisting it, making it impossible to discern where shadow ended and entity began. And then, for a heartbeat, the room fell silent. The figure stopped just a few feet from him, looming like a living nightmare. Ethan's chest heaved, sweat dripping into his eyes, and he realized something horrifying. This was the heart of the lodge, the entity that had been shaping the shadows, the whispers, the endless corridors. It waited for him to act, to acknowledge it, to accept what the lodge demanded. And in that silence, Ethan understood. Leaving was no longer an option. The lodge had claimed him, pulled him into its darkness, and now the only way forward was to confront whatever waited in the center of the room. Ethan's body trembled, his muscles locked as he stared at the figure before him. It did not blink, did not breathe in any way he could perceive, yet the oppressive weight of its presence pressed down upon him like a physical force. The shadows in the room were no longer confined to corners. They crawled across the floor, slinking along the walls, latching themselves to him like living chains. Each movement he made felt sluggish, as if the air itself had thickened, resisting his very will. The whispers returned, layered and dissonant, now louder than ever. They weren't just in his ears anymore, they were inside his skull, speaking directly to the parts of him that he could not control. Face it, stay. They tangled with his thoughts, pushing fear and despair into every corner of his mind. Ethan tried to pull away, tried to close his eyes, but the figure's presence anchored his gaze, compelling him to look, to acknowledge it. Lightning flashed through the distant windows, and in that brief illumination, Ethan saw the figure more clearly. Its form was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs bending at angles that no human body should allow. Its head was featureless, smooth, but faint, fleeting impressions of eyes and a mouth appeared and vanished with every blink of light. It seemed to ripple like water, solid yet liquid, something alive yet alien. Ethan's voice was hoarse, cracked, barely more than a whisper. What do you want?" The figure did not move, but the room seemed to respond. The shadows writhed, thickening, curling around Ethan, brushing against his skin, cold and clammy. Then, from the center of the entity, a sound emerged, a low, rasping murmur like metal scraping stone, carrying words that vibrated directly into Ethan's skull. Acknowledgement, witness, join. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and the shadows responded, rushing toward him, coiling around his ankles. Panic surged. He tried to kick free, to scramble backward, but the floor felt uneven, the shadows clutching him, dragging him inch by inch toward the entity. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, yet every step away seemed to draw him inexorably closer. The whispers intensified, repeating in a maddening cadence. See, face, no. His mind struggled to parse them, but the meaning was clear. Whatever this was, it demanded recognition, demanded that he confront it fully. Ethan's chest burned as he forced himself to stand taller, struggling against the invisible pull of the shadows, his heart hammering in his ears. Slowly, tentatively, he took a step forward. The shadows tightened around him, pressing against his legs and torso, cold and suffocating. The entity did not move, but the air itself seemed to lean toward him, bending around its form, guiding him closer. Each step made the whispers louder, more insistent, more chaotic. Face it, see it, acknowledge, stay, witness, join. Another flash of lightning revealed more detail, or perhaps more illusion. Within the wavering form of the entity, Ethan could see shapes moving, indistinct yet horrifying, limbs, heads, contorted faces twisted in silent screams. They swirled in constant motion, trapped within the entity like insects in amber, writhing in agony. He realized with a shock that made his stomach churn, that the lodge itself might be alive, feeding, storing the essence of every soul that had ever entered its walls. Fear threatened to paralyze him, but another thought pierced through, one stronger, primal. This entity, whatever it was, depended on him succumbing. If he ran, if he gave in, he would be trapped here, as all the shadows of the lodge seemed to be, forever part of its darkness. With trembling hands, Ethan raised his gaze higher, forcing himself to look at the entity's center. The shadows recoiled slightly, as if sensing his defiance, hissing and coiling like serpents around his limbs. The whispers became a singular, deep voice, low and guttural. Witness, witness, join, or be consumed. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing his voice out even though it shook violently. I see you. The words felt absurdly small, fragile against the weight of the entity, yet the effect was immediate. The shadows paused, the coils tightening just slightly less. The entity's form shimmered, pulsing slowly as if considering the acknowledgement. I will not join you, he whispered next, his voice stronger this time, though still trembling. I am still me. Lightning cracked sharply outside, illuminating the room fully for a heartbeat. In that instant, Ethan saw the entity writhe violently as if shocked, its massive shadows undulating and twisting. The whisper screamed in rage and confusion, overlapping, chaotic, then died abruptly, leaving only the rasping of the entity's form. The room itself trembled, dust raining from the ceiling, floorboards groaning beneath him. Ethan's chest heaved. The shadows still clung to him, cold and persistent, but the pull had lessened. The entity's form remained in the center of the room, towering, faceless, a living nightmare, yet it paused and waited, as though calculating, as though measuring the weight of his defiance. Ethan's hands shook, his legs weak, but he forced himself to take another step forward, directly toward the entity. I am here, he said, voice stronger now, fighting to assert itself over the storm inside the lodge. I see you. I acknowledge you, but I am not yours. For a moment, the room held its breath. The shadows on the floor stilled, clinging like wet cloth. The entity did not advance. The flickering firelight revealed the shapes within it moving more slowly, almost hesitating, as if uncertain. And then, the first sound of movement outside the room reached his ears. The staircase groaned, the hall beyond shifting, faint whispers returning, softer this time. Ethan realized that whatever had been trying to claim him had paused, that his acknowledgement, his refusal, had at least earned him a reprieve. But the entity remained, tall, faceless, waiting. Shadows pooling in its presence, creeping across the floor, curling along the walls, a living, breathing mass of darkness. The whispers lingered faintly, threading through the room, reminding him that this encounter was not over, that the lodge itself was patient, eternal, and hungry. Ethan backed toward the door, not taking his eyes off the entity, feeling its oppressive presence pressing against him even as he sought escape. The firelight flickered across its form one last time as he reached for the handle, and for a heartbeat, the lodge seemed to exhale, the shadows recoiling just enough for him to slip past. The door swung open, and the hallway beyond stretched outward, still endless, still dark, still filled with whispers, but he had survived for now. He stepped into the corridor, heart hammering, limbs trembling, knowing that whatever had claimed this lodge, whatever lurked within it, would not release him easily. The storm outside beat against the windows like a drum, the fire below hissed and flickered, and somewhere in the shadows the entity waited, patient, eternal, its whispers fading but never fully gone. See, witness, stay. Ethan moved forward, forced by fear and the need to survive, into the unknown corridors of the lodge, knowing he had only just begun to understand the depth of the darkness that surrounded him. Ethan's legs shook as he forced himself down the endless corridor, his breaths coming in ragged, uneven gasps. The entity in the center of the room had not pursued him, but its presence lingered like a stain, a weight pressing into every corner of the lodge. The shadows it had commanded still crawled along the walls, stretching into his path, curling at the edges of his vision, making the floorboards appear as though they might rise up and swallow him. The hallway stretched ahead, impossibly long, doors lining it like silent witnesses, some ajar, some tightly shut, all exuding a sense of waiting, of awareness. The whispers returned, low and insistent at first, barely audible over the creak of the floor and the faint hiss of the storm outside. Follows a witness, stay. They twisted inside his head, threading into his thoughts, tugging at the edges of his resolve. He pressed his palms to his temples, trying to focus, trying to convince himself that the lodge was only a building, that nothing within could harm him. But the air was heavy with something unseen, something ancient and patient, something that had waited for him long before he had set foot on the threshold. A sudden flicker of movement caught his eye. One of the doors ahead shifted, swinging open with a faint creak. Ethan froze, heart hammering, eyes locked on the opening. The room beyond was darker than the hallway, shadow pooling thickly along the floor, as though it had weight, as though it were alive. And then he saw it, a pair of glowing shapes in the darkness, faint at first, like embers in the gloom. They blinked, moved slightly, and he realized they were eyes watching him from within. Ethan's pulse quickened, his legs trembling. He knew instinctively that he should not look, should not approach, yet something compelled him forward, a pull stronger than fear, stronger than reason. The whispers coiled around him again, overlapping now, a cacophony of voices. Come, a witness. He swallowed hard and took a step closer, the floorboards groaning under his weight, echoing through the endless corridor. The eyes blinked again and a shape emerged, not fully solid, not fully defined. It slid from the shadows, its form thin, elongated, a black smear with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its head was featureless, yet Ethan could sense it watching, judging, measuring. The air around it shimmered faintly, and a cold pressure pressed against his chest. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the whispers had become intelligible, forming words in a voice that was not his own. You are here. You see. You belong. Panic surged, but Ethan forced himself to take another step. The figure moved in perfect unison with him, circling, never leaving the doorway, its presence like a living shadow tethered to his movements. The hallway itself seemed to warp, the doors bending and twisting as if the lodge were a living thing responding to his fear. Lightning flashed through the distant windows, illuminating more figures, hundreds of pale, faceless forms lining the walls, watching, waiting. The shadows that had clung to the floor now reached for him, tendrils of blackness brushing against his ankles, tugging, coiling, testing his resolve. Ethan's hand shook as he gripped the strap of his backpack, using it like an anchor. He forced his gaze forward, toward the next door at the end of the hallway, wider than the others, carved with twisted symbols and faint grooves that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The whispers intensified, now almost deafening, repeating a single word over and over. With a trembling breath, Ethan pushed open the door. Inside, the room was vast, impossibly large, the ceiling lost in shadows, the walls stretching outward beyond what the lodge's exterior should allow. The firelight from below spilled in through cracks in the floorboards, casting long, flickering shadows that writhed unnaturally, moving against the angle of the light. In the center of the room stood another figure, taller and more imposing than any he had seen. Its form was a mass of shifting darkness, limbs twisting and elongating, head tilted at an impossible angle. The shadows around it pulsed, curling toward him, pressing against his skin like cold fingers. Ethan stepped inside cautiously, his boots making no sound on the warped floor. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud vibrating through the room, and for a heartbeat, the entire lodge seemed to exhale, holding its breath. The whispers were back, threading through his mind, louder and clearer. Witness, acknowledge, join. He pressed his palms to his ears, but the voices were inside him, a pressure that made his skull ache. The figure remained motionless, but Ethan could feel it moving in a way that defied space, as though the shadows themselves were extensions of its will. He forced himself to speak, voice trembling. I see you. I acknowledge you. The shadows pulsed in response, recoiling slightly, and the figure's form shifted, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. A low, metallic rasp filled the room, vibrating through the floor and walls. Ethan's heart raced as he realized that the lodge itself seemed to be alive, feeding on the presence of the figures, on his fear, on his very attention. The walls stretched outward, the ceiling pulsed, and the firelight flickered violently, illuminating more shapes hidden in the darkness. Hundreds of faceless forms emerged from the shadows, each bending, swaying, observing him. Ethan's knees trembled, but he forced himself to take another step forward. The whispers became a singular, guttural voice. Face it, see it, remain. He swallowed hard, forcing his gaze to the center figure. Its shadows writhed violently, coiling and uncurling, and he realized that this was the heart of the lodge, the source of the darkness, the entity that had woven the corridors, the shadows, and the whispers. The shadows lunged at him suddenly, coiling around his legs and torso, pulling him closer. Panic surged, but he resisted, planting his feet and forcing his mind to focus. "I am not yours," he shouted, voice cracking but louder than before. "I remain myself." Lightning flashed, illuminating the room fully. For a moment, the entity's form writhed violently, almost as if recoiling, and the shadows released him slightly. The whispers faltered, overlapping, chaotic, then quieted, leaving only a low hum in the air. The firelight flickered one last time across the faces of the hundreds of faceless figures emerging from the walls. They paused, still and silent, watching. Ethan backed toward the far wall, every nerve trembling, legs weak. The figure in the center pulsed, the shadows around it still curling and writhing, but there was hesitation now. He realized he had bought himself time, but the lodge itself had not released him. Its hunger, its patience, its darkness remained, eternal, waiting. And as he stood there, chest heaving, sweat dripping into his eyes, he understood that the lodge was more than a place. It was alive, it was patient, and it would not let him go easily. The storm outside battered the roof, the whispers lingered faintly, threading through his mind. See, witness, stay, forever. Ethan took a trembling step forward, forcing himself to continue, deeper into the lodge, into the darkness that waited, knowing that whatever lay ahead would test him far beyond anything he had faced so far. Ethan moved forward slowly, each step heavy with dread, his boots scraping faintly against the warped floorboards. The lodge seemed to stretch and bend around him, hallways that should have ended opening into new corridors, doors appearing where none had been before. The shadows that had clung to him earlier now moved with intent, shifting across walls and floors, pooling thicker in the corners, their inky forms crawling toward him as though testing his resolve. Each tendril brushed against his skin with a cold, clammy touch, making him shiver violently. The whispers returned, but now they were no longer a chaotic jumble. They spoke in overlapping tones that made words almost comprehensible. Turn, follow, see, witness, understand, belong. Ethan pressed his hands over his ears, but the words burrowed into his mind regardless, threading through his thoughts, gnawing at his resolve. The air was thick with the coppery scent of something old, wet, and iron-like, filling his lungs with every desperate breath. A door to his right creaked open slowly, revealing a room that seemed impossibly deep. The firelight from below barely penetrated the darkness inside, leaving shapes that twisted and shifted in the corners of his vision. He forced himself closer, compelled by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, the whispers urging him forward in insistent pulses. Face. Inside, the floorboards were scarred with scratches, deep gouges that cut across the wood in irregular patterns. Shadows pooled along the walls, curling up and moving like smoke given form. A figure crouched in the center of the room, its back to him. The body was elongated, unnaturally thin, with limbs bending in ways human bones should not. Its head tilted slightly to the side, faceless, but Ethan could feel its attention, could sense its awareness of him as though it were peering directly into his mind. His stomach knotted as he stepped forward, and the shadows reacted instantly, shifting toward him, wrapping around his ankles like black serpents. The whispers intensified, now louder, sharper, cutting through his thoughts. Face it, join, belong, witness. He stumbled backward, heart hammering, and the figure turned slowly, deliberately, tilting its head in a way that made his stomach drop. Lightning flashed, and in the brief illumination, he could see the full extent of the figure's form. Long, spindly limbs, a torso that seemed to ripple like liquid, a faceless head that shimmered with vague impressions of eyes and a mouth. Shadows pulsed from it, coiling outward and filling the room with movement, reaching toward him, pressing against his legs, crawling up the walls, writhing across the ceiling. The lodge itself seemed alive, vibrating, responding to his fear. Ethan forced himself to speak, voice trembling but audible. I see you. I acknowledge you." The shadows recoiled slightly, the tendrils that had wrapped around him loosening just enough for him to step backward. The figure's faceless head tilted again as if considering his words, and for a brief moment, the room felt almost still. Then the floorboards groaned beneath him and the lodge shifted. The walls elongated, stretching the corridor outside the room impossibly far. Doors along the hall twisted open and shut as if breathing. From somewhere deep within the building, a dragging sound began, slow and deliberate, moving toward him. Ethan's pulse quickened. He knew instinctively that whatever waited beyond the next bend was no ordinary shadow. Another corridor appeared where there had been none, narrow and low, walls pressing inward, forcing him to crouch as he moved forward. The air grew colder, damper, smelling of wet earth and decay. Shadows pooled thickly along the edges, crawling across the floor and up the walls, following his movements, pressing against him without touching, watching with intent. He stumbled into another room, larger than the last, its ceiling lost in darkness. The firelight from below barely reached it, flickering weakly across the walls. In the center stood another figure, taller, broader, its form rippling like liquid shadow. It exuded a palpable pressure, a weight on the chest, a pull that made each breath difficult. The shadows around it swirled, pulsing, reaching toward him, pulling at his resolve. Ethan's hands shook as he raised them, trying to defend himself, trying to assert his presence. "I am still me. I am not yours." The shadows recoiled slightly, the figures paused, but the lodge itself groaned, vibrating through the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Dust rained from above, the smell of wet wood and rot filling his nostrils. The whispers merged into a single guttural voice. "Face it, witness, remain." Ethan's knees trembled, but he took a deliberate step forward, forcing himself to keep his gaze fixed on the central figure. Each step sent tendrils of shadow writhing backward slightly, like the lodge hesitated, measuring him. A flash of lightning illuminated hundreds of pale, faceless figures emerging from the shadows along the walls. They swayed slowly, their limbs bending at impossible angles, heads tilting toward him in unison. The shadows pressed in closer, curling around his feet, brushing his arms, a cold, clammy grip that made him shiver violently. Ethan swallowed, forcing himself to take another step. The entity's faceless head tilted again, and the whispers softened, almost imperceptibly, threading through his mind. "You see, you witness." The room itself pulsed in response, as if the lodge itself acknowledged his defiance. The dragging sound from deeper in the lodge grew louder, echoing down impossible corridors, a reminder that the building itself was alive, patient, and hungry. He stepped forward again and again, each step deliberate, each breath a struggle against the oppressive weight pressing down on him. The shadows responded, coiling and uncurling but not advancing. The faceless figure in the center remained still, its presence immense, eternal, a reminder that the lodge's heart was patient, and it would wait as long as necessary. Ethan realized something terrifying. He had survived so far not because he was strong, but because the lodge was testing him, measuring his will, his acknowledgement of its presence. And deeper within, he knew there were more horrors, more shadows, more entities waiting, watching, ready to challenge him further. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, doors twisting open and shut as if breathing, shadows pooling and crawling like living darkness. The storm outside roared, the whispers lingered, and the lodge waited. Ethan forced himself to move, to keep walking, knowing that each step forward was a step deeper into the nightmare, and that whatever lay ahead would demand more than fear. It would demand that he confront the lodge itself and the darkness that dwelled within it. Ethan moved cautiously through the endless corridor, every step feeling heavier than the last. The lodge seemed alive, stretching and twisting in ways that made no architectural sense, hallways folding back on themselves, doors appearing where none had been moments before. Shadows clung to the walls, flowing and pooling like thick liquid, writhing toward him with intent, brushing against his skin with a cold, clammy touch that made him shiver violently. The whispers pressed into his mind, low and persistent, now forming words he could barely decipher. Follow, see, witness, understand, remain. The hallway opened into a large, irregular chamber. Its ceiling was lost in darkness, the edges of the room bleeding into shadows so thick that they seemed almost tangible. Faint flickers of firelight from the lower floors filtered up through cracks in the warped floorboards, casting irregular, trembling shapes that stretched along the walls. Ethan's boots scuffed silently against the warped wood as he stepped inside, and the room seemed to exhale a slow, deliberate breath. At the center of the chamber stood a figure taller and darker than any he had encountered so far. Its limbs were impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles, and its head was faceless, smooth yet faintly shimmering with impressions of eyes and a mouth that disappeared when he looked too closely. The shadows around it pulsed like ink dropped in water, crawling along the floor and walls, curling toward him in slow, deliberate movements. The whispers intensified, louder and more urgent, threading into his mind. Face it, see, witness, join, remain. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run, but the lodge itself seemed to resist him. The walls twisted, elongating the corridor behind him, stretching it so far that escape felt impossible. Every door he had passed now appeared along the edges of the room, ajar or warped, filled with crawling shadows that watched him, waiting. Ethan forced himself to speak, his voice shaking but audible. I see you. I acknowledge you. The shadows recoiled slightly, the tendrils loosening just enough for him to take another step. The figure in the center remained motionless but seemed to pulse, the shadows around it rippling like water disturbed by a stone. A sudden scraping sound echoed from deeper in the lodge, low and deliberate, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The shadows responded immediately, shifting and stretching toward the source of the sound, then retreating slightly, leaving Ethan partially free to move. He realized with a sinking feeling that the lodge itself was alive, feeding on fear, observing his every movement, adjusting, testing. Ethan pressed forward, each step deliberate, trying to keep his gaze fixed on the central figure. The whispers merged into a singular, guttural voice. Face it, see it, remain a witness. The shadows writhed violently, coiling and uncurling, and Ethan felt a cold pressure pressing against his chest, making every breath a struggle. The walls of the chamber seemed to pulse now, expanding and contracting in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if the lodge itself were breathing. Shadows rose from the floor like smoke, forming twisted shapes that reached toward him, bending and curling at impossible angles. Ethan forced himself to step forward again, forcing his mind to focus despite the oppressive weight of fear pressing in on every side. Lightning flashed through the distant windows, illuminating hundreds of pale, faceless figures emerging from the shadows along the walls. They swayed slowly, their limbs bending at impossible angles, heads tilting in unison toward him. The shadows coiled tighter around his feet, brushing against his arms and legs, cold and clammy, but not advancing aggressively. It was as though the lodge was gauging him, measuring his resolve, determining whether he would endure. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to take another step. The figure in the center pulsed, the shadows around it curling and uncurling like living smoke. He realized, with a thrill of terror, that this entity was the heart of the lodge, the source of the darkness that had twisted the corridors and animated the shadows. It exuded a patient, eternal hunger, yet it hesitated. His acknowledgement, his refusal to succumb, had delayed whatever it intended to do, but the game was far from over. The whispers returned, soft now, almost imperceptible, threading through the room. See, witness, remain, forever. Ethan's knees trembled, but he forced himself to move, step by step, deeper into the chamber, toward the center, toward the entity itself. The shadows responded in kind, pulsing and shifting around him, some brushing against his skin, some recoiling, all of them alive, sentient, testing his courage. A low, metallic rasp echoed through the chamber, vibrating in the floor and walls. The figure's limbs twisted, elongating, stretching upward until its head almost brushed the invisible ceiling, and the shadows erupted in motion, swirling faster, curling around the walls and across the floor, creating an oppressive living mass of darkness. Ethan's chest burned, lungs straining to inhale the thick, iron-scented air. He stopped for a moment, forcing his gaze upward to meet the faceless head of the entity. He felt its awareness, its hunger, its attention pressing into him, yet he did not turn away. Or remain myself, he whispered, voice trembling but determined. I am not yours. The shadows stilled, just slightly, and the figure pulsed, its form rippling like water as though considering him. The lodge seemed to exhale once more, a deep, resonant vibration that shook the walls and floor beneath him. Ethan knew he had survived for now, not because he was stronger, but because the lodge was patient, eternal, willing to wait. But he also understood something horrifying. This was only the beginning. The lodge had depths he could not yet imagine, corridors that defied reality, shadows that could move independently, and entities even more terrible than the one in the center. The storm outside roared, the fire below hissed and flickered, and somewhere in the distance, a dragging sound grew louder, reminding him that the lodge was alive, watching and waiting. Ethan forced himself to move forward, each step a battle against fear, against the oppressive weight pressing from every side. The whispers lingered faintly, threading through the room. See, witness, remain, forever. He knew that he could not stop, could not succumb, and that the lodge would test him endlessly, shaping him with shadows, whispers, and impossible corridors, until he either broke or understood the dark heart that beat at its center. Ethan pressed forward, each step through the lodge feeling heavier than the last. The hallway ahead stretched impossibly, twisting in ways that made his stomach lurch, bending back on itself, opening into spaces that should have been behind him moments ago. The walls were lined with doors, some cracked open, some tightly shut, all exuding a silent, patient awareness, as though the lodge itself were alive, watching, calculating his every movement. Shadows pooled along the floor, crawling toward him in deliberate, creeping waves. Tendrils of darkness brushed against his ankles and calves, cold and wet, making his skin prickle and his heart hammer uncontrollably. The whispers had grown louder, threading into his skull like thorny vines. See, witness, follow, remain, belong. They were no longer just voices. They were a presence pressing against his consciousness, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Ethan pressed his palms to his temples, trying to resist, but the words burrowed deeper, gnawing at his resolve. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but the lodge itself resisted, stretching and shifting, reshaping the hallway to keep him moving forward. A door suddenly swung open on his left, revealing a room that seemed impossibly deep. The floor sloped downward into shadows that swallowed the flickering firelight from below, and pale figures emerged from the darkness within. Their heads tilted at unnatural angles, faceless, limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy, and their eyes, or where eyes should have been, glimmered faintly, reflecting the light in tiny, pinprick sparks. Ethan's stomach twisted, a cold wave of nausea washing over him, but the whispers insisted. See, witness, face. He forced himself to step inside, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The figures did not move, yet their presence pressed into him, overwhelming, heavy, almost tangible. Shadows poured from the walls, curling like living smoke, thickening and stretching toward him, brushing against his legs and torso. The room seemed impossibly large, the ceiling lost in darkness, the walls bending and warping, creating the sense that the lodge itself was alive, breathing, and reshaping the space around him in response to his fear. He saw another figure at the center of the room, taller and darker than the others, faceless, its limbs long and sinuous. Shadows pulsed from it, curling along the floor, rising along the walls. Ethan's chest tightened. Every breath felt like he was inhaling wet darkness. He forced himself to speak, voice trembling but audible. I see you. I acknowledge you. The shadows recoiled slightly, rippling like ink in water, and the central figure's head tilted, considering him. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, low and guttural. Face it, remain a witness, belong. Ethan swallowed hard, every muscle tense, heart hammering. He took another step forward, feeling the cold, clammy shadows brush against his arms, testing, probing, yet hesitating. The walls of the chamber pulsed now, expanding and contracting as though the lodge itself breathed. Shadows erupted from the corners, slithering across the floor, curling along the walls, twisting into grotesque forms. Figures emerged from the darkness along the walls, hundreds of pale, faceless entities, swaying and bending at impossible angles, watching him with silent, patient attention. Ethan realized, with a sinking terror, that the lodge was alive in a way he could barely comprehend. It fed on fear, on acknowledgement, on his very attention. Each movement, each acknowledgement, was observed, measured, weighed. Lightning flashed through distant windows, illuminating the sprawling shadows and faceless figures in stark relief, and for a moment, the lodge seemed almost suspended, waiting, patient, eternal. Then a sound emerged from deep within the lodge, a low, scraping, dragging noise that echoed through impossible corridors. The shadows reacted instantly, recoiling slightly, then stretching toward the sound, shifting as though in response to an unseen command. Ethan's pulse quickened. He knew instinctively that the lodge's reach extended far beyond what he had seen, that these corridors, these shadows, were merely extensions of something far older and darker at its heart. He pressed forward, each step deliberate, forcing himself to confront the oppressive weight of the lodge. The whispers softened, threading through the shadows. See, witness, remain. He took another step, then another, the shadows curling and recoiling in response to his movements. The central figure pulsed, the tendrils of shadow around it rippling, and Ethan realized with a shiver that this was the heart of the lodge, the source of the impossible architecture, the shadows, the whispers. The walls twisted further, corridors folding over themselves, doors appearing where there had been none. Shadows lunged at him suddenly, coiling around his legs, brushing his arms and chest with clammy, suffocating cold. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps, every instinct screaming at him to flee, yet he forced himself forward. Or remain myself, he whispered, voice shaking but determined. I am not yours. The shadows recoiled slightly, the central figure pulsed violently, and for the first time Ethan sensed hesitation in the lodge itself. The dragging sound from deep within the impossible corridors grew louder, echoing through the warped walls, a reminder that the lodge was patient, eternal, and hungry. Ethan forced himself to take another step forward, the whispers threading faintly through the room. See, witness, remain, forever. The lodge shifted again, corridors twisting, walls breathing, shadows reacting. He realized that he had survived so far not because he was stronger, but because the lodge was patient, willing to test him, willing to wait. But the heart of the lodge pulsed ahead, and Ethan knew with every fiber of his being that whatever lay beyond the next corridor, whatever lurked in the shadows, would demand more than acknowledgement. It would demand confrontation, endurance, and a will strong enough to face the eternal darkness at its core. Ethan stumbled forward, boots scraping against warped floorboards that seemed to stretch beneath him with every step. The corridor twisted unnaturally, bending back on itself in impossible ways, doors appearing where he was certain there had been none moments ago. Shadows clung to the walls, crawling in waves, their inky forms stretching toward him, curling around his ankles and legs like cold, living chains. The whispers were louder now, threading into his mind with piercing insistence. Follow, witness, remain, belong. Each word gnawed at his resolve, pressing into him, testing the limits of his fear. Ahead, a faint flicker of firelight revealed a doorway that had not existed before. The edges of the room beyond were swallowed by darkness so thick it seemed almost tangible, undulating like a living liquid. Ethan hesitated, but the whispers pressed in, insistent. See, face it, witness, remain. He forced his feet forward, stepping into the room, and immediately felt the lodge respond. The shadows erupted from the walls, curling and coiling around the floor, pressing against him with a suffocating cold. At the center of the room, a figure emerged from the darkness, taller and more grotesque than any Ethan had encountered. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its torso rippled like liquid shadow, and its faceless head tilted toward him, a presence both patient and predatory. The shadows around it pulsed rhythmically, undulating outward, brushing against Ethan's arms and legs, testing his will. He swallowed hard and whispered, I see you. I acknowledge you. The shadows recoiled slightly, rippling like waves in water, yet the figure remained still, watching, waiting. Then the lodge shifted. The floorboards beneath him groaned and warped, rising and falling as if breathing, and the walls stretched outward, bending in impossible curves. The doors along the edges twisted open and shut, revealing glimpses of rooms that should not exist, staircases that led into darkness, and hallways folding back into themselves. The lodge was alive, and it was aware of him. A dragging sound echoed from deep within the building, slow and deliberate, vibrating through the walls, floor, and ceiling. The shadows responded instantly, moving in the direction of the sound, then curling back toward him. Ethan's pulse quickened. He realized instinctively that the lodge's reach extended far beyond what he could see. The corridors, the shadows, the faceless figures lining the walls, they were all part of a larger intelligence, a dark, patient force that had waited for him to arrive. Ethan forced himself to continue, each step deliberate, heart hammering, lungs burning with every strained breath. The whispers merged into a single low voice that vibrated directly in his skull. Face it, remain, witness, belong. The shadows lunged suddenly, coiling around his ankles and torso, brushing his arms with a clammy, suffocating cold. Panic surged, but he forced himself to step forward, voice trembling. I will remain myself. I am not yours. The figure at the center pulsed violently in response, shadows rippling outward in a living tide, yet it did not advance. The lodge itself groaned and shifted, walls bending, ceilings stretching, corridors folding in on themselves. Ethan realized with a growing horror that the lodge was not a building. It was a living organism, a predator that had waited centuries for prey who would enter its grasp. From the corners of the room, more figures emerged, tall, thin, faceless, limbs bending in impossible angles, swaying in unison toward him. Shadows poured from the walls like ink, forming shapes that lunged and recoiled, testing his reflexes, probing his fear. Lightning flashed through cracks in the warped floorboards, illuminating 1,000 tiny glimmers in the darkness. Eyes, reflections, movements he could not fully comprehend. The lodge was alive, a breathing, patient, eternal horror. Ethan's knees trembled as he took another step. The whispers softened slightly, threading through his mind like fragile tendrils. See, witness, remain, forever. He pressed forward, heart hammering, knowing he could not stop. Each step was a test, each acknowledgement of the lodge's presence and negotiation with its dark intelligence. The shadows lunged again, coiling higher this time, brushing against his shoulders, chest, and face. He stumbled, fighting the cold pressure pressing on him, but forced himself upright. The central figure pulsed violently again, sending ripples of shadow racing across the walls, crawling up the ceiling and pooling in the corners. Ethan realized the lodge itself was responding to him, measuring his resolve, shaping its corridors, its shadows, its impossible architecture to test him, to bend him, to break him. He swallowed hard, forcing words out. I see you. Acknowledge you. I am still me. For a moment, the lodge paused, the shadows hesitated, the central figure rippled but did not advance. Then the floor beneath him tilted slightly, forcing him to stagger, and the walls rippled like liquid. Doors that had been behind him disappeared. New corridors opened ahead, twisting impossibly, stretching endlessly. The dragging sound grew louder, echoing through the impossible hallways, reminding him that the lodge was eternal, patient, and hungry. Ethan pressed forward again, shadows coiling and lunging, whispering words that shredded the edges of his mind. See, witness, remain, face it, belong. The faceless figures along the walls tilted their heads in unison, swaying closer, limbs bending in ways that should have been impossible. Lightning flashed again, revealing glimpses of countless shapes within the shadows, distorted forms that seemed to move independently, each observing him, measuring him, testing his courage. He realized with a surge of terror that he had survived so far not because he was strong, but because the lodge was patient. It was eternal. It would wait, it would observe, it would test, shaping him through fear, shadows, whispers, and impossible spaces. And somewhere deep within, the central figure pulsed, the heart of the lodge, eternal and patient, watching him with a presence that defied comprehension. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing his legs to move forward despite exhaustion, terror, and the oppressive weight of the lodge pressing on every side. The whispers threaded through his mind faintly. See, witness, remain, forever. He stepped into the next corridor, deeper into the lodge, knowing that every step forward was a descent into a nightmare without end, and that the horrors waiting ahead would demand more than acknowledgement. They would demand endurance, willpower, and confrontation with the very heart of darkness that pulsed at the center of this living, breathing nightmare. Ethan's boots scraped against the warped floorboards as he stumbled through the twisting corridors. The lodge seemed to bend around him, folding space in impossible ways, corridors overlapping themselves, doors appearing where none had been moments ago. Shadows clung to the walls, crawling along the floor and curling around his ankles and calves like cold, wet chains. They moved with intent now, faster, more deliberate, pressing against him, testing his strength, his fear. The whispers had escalated into a chorus, threading into his mind like razor-sharp vines. Follow, see, witness, remain, belong, submit. He tried to shake them from his thoughts, pressing his palms to his temples, but the voices penetrated deeper, gnawing at his sanity. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, yet the lodge had warped the corridor behind him. What had been a straight path moments ago now looped back impossibly, doors that had led to exits disappeared, replaced by walls that stretched endlessly. The lodge was alive, aware, hunting him. Lightning flashed through cracks in the warped floorboards, illuminating a figure ahead. It was one of the faceless ones, but taller, larger, its limbs bending in grotesque, unnatural angles. Shadows poured from it, crawling like black rivers along the floor, rising along the walls, coiling toward him with sinister intent. Ethan froze, heart hammering, breath caught in his throat. The whispers became louder, sharper. Face it, witness, remain, join, belong. The figure lunged. Shadows erupted from it, wrapping around Ethan's legs, chest, arms. Cold pressed into his skin like frozen iron, constricting, holding him fast. He struggled, every movement resisted by the lodge itself, and the figure moved impossibly, sliding along the shadows, its limbs bending like liquid, its faceless head tilting toward him in a slow, deliberate mockery of observation. Ethan's voice cracked as he shouted, I remain myself. I am not yours. The shadows recoiled slightly, but the figure advanced again, and more faceless forms emerged from the walls, hundreds now, filling the corridor with swaying, bending, impossible bodies. They tilted their heads in unison, limbs twisting, shadows curling in response to his every movement. The lodge itself pulsed, vibrating beneath him, stretching the corridors further, bending the walls, folding the ceiling down. He stumbled into a room larger than any he had seen, its floor sloping into darkness, walls bleeding into shadow. Lightning illuminated hundreds of figures in the corners, all swaying, faceless, waiting. Shadows lunged at him from every direction. He stumbled, yelped, forced himself upright and ran, boots scraping across warped wood as the lodge groaned, bending the room around him, reshaping it, forcing him into the hunt. The dragging sound echoed louder now, slow, deliberate, filling the lodge, vibrating through the walls and floor. Shadows twisted and lunged as though answering it, surrounding him from all sides. Ethan's chest burned with exertion, lungs straining with every breath. The whispers were deafening. See, witness, remain, belong, submit, witness. He forced his gaze forward, stepping carefully into another corridor that twisted impossibly, staircases folding into themselves, doors appearing and disappearing. Suddenly, shadows exploded from the walls, rising like black flames, wrapping around him, pressing into him, trying to drag him into the dark. Ethan fell to his knees, fighting, shouting, "I am not yours." Pain shot through his legs as the shadows tightened, but he forced himself upright, forcing each step forward, even as the lodge seemed to pulse beneath him as though it were alive, a predator measuring its prey, bending space and time, feeding on fear. He stumbled into a room that seemed impossibly tall, ceiling lost in darkness, shadows pooling like liquid across the floor. At the center stood the largest figure yet, its body elongated and sinuous, faceless head tilting, shadows rippling outward, reaching for him in waves. Lightning flashed, revealing hundreds of smaller faceless figures crawling along the walls, limbs twisting, bending, observing, waiting. The whispers pressed in relentlessly, "Face it, he was witness, remain, forever, belong." Ethan swallowed hard, forcing his legs to move despite exhaustion, despite terror. He stepped closer to the central figure, and it pulsed, shadows exploding outward in violent waves that swept across the walls, floor, and ceiling. The smaller figures lunged at him in synchronized motion, shadows wrapping around him again, cold, clammy, suffocating. Pain and terror twisted his mind, but he forced himself to shout, voice trembling, "I will remain myself. I am not yours." The lodge hesitated. Shadows recoiled slightly. The central figure pulsed violently, tendrils of darkness curling around it, reaching for him, probing, testing. The walls twisted and bent further, corridors folding into themselves, rooms multiplying, appearing and disappearing in impossible sequences. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, vibrating through the very floor beneath him. The lodge itself was alive, eternal, hungry, patient, but for a moment, uncertain. Ethan pressed forward, one step after another, ignoring the burning pain in his legs, the suffocating cold of the shadows, the whispers gnawing at his mind. See, witness, remain, forever, belong. He knew that he could not stop, that to survive, he had to confront the lodge, endure its tests, face its horrors, and move ever forward. Each corridor, each figure, each shadow was a challenge, a measure of his resolve, and the lodge would not relent until he either broke or understood the dark heart that pulsed at its center. And somewhere deeper, the central figure, the heart of the lodge, watched him, patient, eternal, pulsing with dark anticipation, waiting for the moment when it would demand not just acknowledgement, but full surrender, full confrontation, full reckoning. Ethan stepped into the next corridor, deeper into the living nightmare, the whispers trailing him like 1,000 cold fingers. See, witness, remain, belong, forever. Ethan's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he ran through the twisting corridors, the lodge shifting around him, bending impossibly. Doors appeared and disappeared in the walls, staircases folded into themselves, and the shadows lunged from every corner, crawling along the floor and climbing up the walls with a fluid, predatory intent. Their cold, clammy touch pressed against him, wrapping around his arms, legs, torso, each movement met with resistance as though the lodge itself were alive, holding him in its grip. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus that carved into his skull. See, witness, remain, belong, submit, face it. The corridor opened abruptly into a vast chamber that seemed impossibly tall, the ceiling lost in darkness, shadows pooling like liquid across the floor. Lightning flashed through cracks in the warped boards, illuminating hundreds of faceless figures swaying and bending at unnatural angles, all converging on him with synchronized predatory motion. At the center of the room stood the largest figure yet, faceless and elongated, limbs bending like liquid, shadow rippling outward in waves that seemed to warp the very air around it. Ethan's stomach churned, every nerve screaming in terror, yet he forced himself forward. Suddenly the shadows attacked in force. Tendrils shot from the walls, curling around his legs and arms, wrapping tightly like icy iron chains. He screamed, forcing his arms free, stumbling backward, only for more shadows to coil around him from the ceiling, pressing down, constricting, dragging at his chest. The lodge itself groaned and pulsed, corridors stretching and twisting, walls folding in on themselves as if to crush him. Each step became a battle, every movement met with resistance from unseen forces, the cold shadows testing his will, his resolve, his very grip on reality. "I am not yours," he shouted, voice trembling but fierce. "I remain myself." The shadows recoiled slightly at his defiance, then surged again, faster, more aggressive, coiling around him like living predators. Figures emerged from the corners, faceless, twisting, bending impossibly, their movements synchronized, a predatory dance that sought to overwhelm him. Lightning illuminated them in brief bursts, hundreds of forms swaying, lunging, waiting, their presence pressing into him, suffocating, almost tangible. The whispers intensified, cutting through his thoughts like jagged knives. See, witness, remain, belong, forever, submit, witness, join. Pain shot through his legs as shadows wrapped tighter, yet he forced himself upright, heart hammering, lungs burning with every strained breath. The lodge itself shifted in response to the chaos, corridors folding into one another, doors appearing and vanishing, the ceiling stretching impossibly high, the floor undulating beneath him. Every movement felt both impossible and crucial, as though the lodge were testing him at every step, shaping him, breaking him, yet keeping him alive just long enough to measure him. Ethan staggered, shoving shadows away with desperate force, his voice rising over the whispers. "I am still me. I am not yours." The central figure pulsed violently in response, tendrils of shadow rippling outward in waves that swept across the room, climbing the walls, pooling along the floor, lunging at him like living water. Hundreds of smaller faceless figures emerged from the corners, their limbs bending in impossible angles, swaying closer, shadows brushing and biting at him, testing his endurance, his focus, his courage. The dragging sound echoed from deep within the lodge, vibrating through the walls and floors, and the shadows responded as though commanded. They lunged in synchronized waves, surrounding him, pressing, constricting, forcing him to move, to run deeper into the lodge. He stumbled, nearly falling, but forced himself forward, every step a battle against not just the shadows, but the building itself, which bent, stretched, twisted, warping reality around him. Lightning flashed, revealing glimpses of the countless horrors lurking in the darkness. Faceless figures crawling along the walls, twisting and bending in impossible angles. Shadows stretching impossibly long, coiling and curling in predatory patterns. The lodge itself pulsing, breathing, alive, sentient, eternal, and hungry. The whispers merged into a single voice, low and guttural. "Face it, witness, remain, belong, submit, endure." Ethan pressed onward, forcing himself through the suffocating, writhing shadows, stepping into another corridor that twisted impossibly, folding over itself like a spiral. The walls pulsed, bending, doors appearing and disappearing, staircases folding into darkness. The lodge was alive, watching, testing, hunting him. Every breath he drew felt heavy with iron-scented air, every heartbeat thundered in his ears. He knew instinctively that this was no ordinary building, no ordinary nightmare. The lodge was a predator, eternal, intelligent, and it fed on fear, resolve, and acknowledgement. The central figure pulsed again, sending ripples of darkness through the shadows, and Ethan realized with cold clarity that it was the heart of the lodge, the source of the impossible architecture, the whispering, the hunting. Its tendrils lashed out again, shadows lunging at him in waves, coiling, wrapping, pressing, testing his endurance and courage. Pain, fear, exhaustion surged through him, yet he forced himself to shout, voice breaking but fierce, "I am not yours. I remain myself." For a fleeting moment, the shadows hesitated, recoiled slightly, and the central figure rippled as though considering him. The lodge pulsed, walls stretching and bending, floors undulating, doors appearing and disappearing in impossible sequences. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, echoing through the corridors, vibrating through the floors, a reminder that the lodge was eternal, patient, and hungry, and it would not relent until he either broke or truly understood the darkness at its heart. Ethan pressed forward, step by step, heart pounding, lungs burning, shadows lunging and rapping, faceless figures swaying, whispering, testing, every corridor, every fold, every pulse of the lodge a measure of his endurance. He knew now that survival required more than defiance. It required confrontation, understanding, and a willingness to face the lodge's eternal, living darkness without surrender. And somewhere deeper, the central figure watched, patient, eternal, its faceless presence pulsing with anticipation, waiting for the moment when it would demand not just acknowledgement, but full confrontation, full endurance, and the ultimate reckoning within the heart of the lodge itself. Ethan stumbled forward, boots scraping across warped boards that seemed to stretch and twist beneath him, the corridors folding impossibly in on themselves. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the lodge itself pressed down on him with a cold, sentient weight. Shadows clung to the walls and floors, creeping along like living ink, wrapping around his ankles and calves, reaching higher along his legs with each desperate step. The faceless figures, hundreds now, swayed from the edges of corridors, twisting in impossible angles, limbs bending like thin branches in a storm, eyes, or the faint glimmers where eyes should have been, fixed on him with an unnerving, patient intent. The whispers had escalated beyond recognition, threading into his mind with jagged insistence. Face it, witness, remain, belong, submit, endure, join, forever. Every word clawed at the edges of his thoughts, gnawing at his resolve, testing the thin barrier of sanity he still maintained. He pressed forward, forcing his shaking legs to move, every step a battle against both the lodge and the shadows that sought to crush his will. Ahead, a massive doorway yawned, impossibly tall, its edges bleeding into darkness that seemed alive. A pulsing light emanated from within, casting the shadows in a dance of impossible shapes. Ethan felt the temperature drop, the air thickening with iron and cold, a suffocating presence pressing into his lungs. He realized with a chill that this was it, the heart of the lodge, the source of the whispers, the shadows, the faceless figures. Stepping inside, he was immediately assaulted by darkness. Shadows lunged at him from every corner, wrapping around him in constrictive coils, climbing his arms, pressing into his chest, cold and wet, almost sentient in their aggression. Faceless figures emerged from the walls, hundreds, swaying and bending, closing in, testing his endurance. Ethan gasped for air, muscles trembling, but forced himself upright, forcing each step forward, voice shaking as he shouted, "I will remain myself. I am not yours." The central figure pulsed in response. Taller, darker than any other, limbs elongated and twisting in impossible directions, head faceless yet somehow observing him directly. Shadows rippled from it in waves, crashing against Ethan like a storm, coiling around his legs, arms, and torso. The walls of the chamber breathed, stretching upward and folding inward, doors appearing and disappearing in impossible sequences, corridors extending into darkness that defied comprehension. The lodge itself was alive, an eternal predator, feeding on fear, courage, endurance, and acknowledgement. Lightning flashed through cracks in the warped ceiling, illuminating hundreds of smaller faceless figures crawling along the walls and pooling in corners. Shadows erupted like black flames, attacking from every direction, coiling, lashing, pressing, attempting to overwhelm him. The whispers intensified, now a singular, deafening presence in his mind. Face it, witness, remain, belong, forever, submit, endure, surrender. Ethan forced himself to step closer to the central figure, every movement a battle against the lodge's gravity, the pulling, twisting corridors, the suffocating weight of shadows. Pain shot through his legs, his chest burned, lungs straining with every ragged breath, yet he forced words out, trembling but resolute. "I am not yours. I remain myself." The central figure pulsed violently, shadows exploding outward in violent waves that surged along the walls, floor, and ceiling. Faceless figures lunged in synchronized motion, shadows wrapping and coiling with predatory precision. The lodge shifted beneath him, corridors folding in on themselves, floors undulating, walls stretching and bending, doors appearing and vanishing. Each movement was a test, each breath a battle, each acknowledgement a negotiation with the lodge itself. The dragging sound echoed from deep within the lodge, vibrating through the floor, walls, and ceiling, and the shadows responded immediately, lunging with renewed aggression. Ethan stumbled, nearly falling, but forced himself forward, every step a testament to endurance and defiance. Lightning flashed again, revealing glimpses of horrors in the darkness. Faceless figures crawling along walls, shadows stretching impossibly, and the lodge itself pulsing, breathing, alive, sentient, eternal. Ethan realized something terrifying. This was no ordinary building, no ordinary nightmare. The lodge was a predator, patient, intelligent, feeding on every shred of fear, courage, and acknowledgement. Each shadow, each corridor, each faceless figure was an extension of its consciousness, measuring him, bending reality, shaping him through terror, testing his resolve to the limit. He stepped closer to the central figure, standing now in the heart of the lodge, and the shadows lunged one final time, coiling around him like living chains, pressing into his chest, arms, and legs. The whispers became a roaring crescendo in his mind. Face it, witness, remain, belong, forever, surrender, endure. Pain, exhaustion, and terror surged through him, yet he forced himself upright, voice trembling but fierce. I am still me. I remain myself. For a fleeting moment, the shadows recoiled. The central figure rippled as though considering him. The lodge pulsed, walls stretching and bending, floors undulating, doors appearing and disappearing, corridors folding impossibly. The dragging sound from deep within grew louder, echoing through the lodge, a reminder that this entity, this predator, was eternal, patient, and hungry. Ethan pressed forward, step by step, into the center of the heart, surrounded by shadows, faceless figures, impossible architecture. He understood now that survival would require more than defiance. It would demand endurance, confrontation, and comprehension of the lodge itself, an entity that defied reality, a living nightmare, eternal and intelligent, testing him to the very edge of fear, sanity, and courage. Ethan stood at the center of the impossibly tall chamber, the heart of the lodge looming above him like a sentient nightmare. The central figure pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, shadows coiling outward like liquid, black tendrils stretching and twisting toward him, probing, testing. The faceless figures along the walls swayed in unison, limbs bending at impossible angles, shadows writhing across the floor like rivers of ink. The whispers were deafening now, no longer mere words but a living presence inside his skull. See, witness, remain, belong, surrender, face it, endure, forever, join. Ethan's heart pounded so violently he thought it might burst, every muscle in his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The lodge pressed against him, cold and clammy, the shadows pressing into his chest and arms, wrapping around his legs like chains, trying to drag him into the darkness. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, yet he knew he could not. To survive, he had to confront this impossibility, the heart of the lodge itself. I am still me, he shouted, voice cracking but strong enough to cut through the cacophony of whispers. I remain myself. The central figure rippled violently, waves of shadow lashing outward, sweeping the chamber. The smaller faceless figures lunged in synchronized motion, wrapping tendrils around Ethan, pulling, pressing, testing. He staggered but forced himself to take another step, then another, forcing the chains of shadow to recoil with the sheer will of his defiance. The lodge responded, corridors folding and twisting around the chamber, walls bending impossibly, staircases folding back into darkness, the ceiling stretching higher than the eye could perceive. Every step forward was a battle against reality itself. Lightning flashed, illuminating the central figure in full for a split second. Its limbs twisted in angles that defied anatomy, the faceless head tilting in a way that made Ethan's stomach churn. Shadows poured from it like a black flood, coiling along the floor and walls, lunging at him with a predatory intent. The whispers intensified, now a roaring tide that pressed on his consciousness. Face it, witness, remain, belong, surrender, endure, submit, forever, join. Ethan forced himself to step closer, ignoring the icy pressure of shadows, the suffocating darkness, the relentless twisting of the lodge's impossible architecture. His voice rose over the whispers. I am not yours, or remain myself. I face you. The central figure pulsed violently in response, shadows erupting in violent waves, crashing into him from all sides. He stumbled, nearly falling, but forced himself upright, driving one foot forward, then another, stepping into the heart of the chamber, closer to the figure than ever before. The lodge groaned, walls bending, floors undulating, doors appearing and vanishing, corridors stretching into infinite darkness. The dragging sound echoed again, louder, vibrating through the entire structure, a reminder that this being was eternal, patient, and hungry. The faceless figures lunged again, shadows wrapping around him, coiling tighter, climbing higher, pressing into him from every direction. Pain shot through his chest and legs, but he forced a cry, defiant and raw. I am still me. I will not be yours. For a moment the lodge seemed to pause. The shadows recoiled slightly. The central figure rippled, tendrils curling but not striking, as if studying him, calculating his strength, endurance, and courage. The chamber seemed impossibly still, only the echoes of his voice bouncing through the warped walls. Ethan felt every heartbeat, every shudder of his muscles, every ragged breath. He understood that the lodge was not merely attacking. It was testing, measuring him, shaping the impossible architecture to challenge his mind and spirit. Lightning flashed again, illuminating hundreds of faceless figures, shadows pooling like liquid, twisting and crawling along the walls. The lodge pulsed in response to his defiance, walls bending, floors shifting, corridors folding over themselves. The whispers merged into a single voice, low, guttural, eternal. Face it, witness, remain, belong, endure, submit, survive, forever. Ethan pressed forward, step by agonizing step, into the center of the chamber. The shadows coiled tighter, the faceless figures swayed closer, and the central figure pulsed in synchronization, tendrils lashing outward, wrapping, pressing, probing. He forced words out through teeth clenched in exhaustion and fear. I will remain myself. I will not be yours. I confront you. The central figure rippled violently, the chamber trembling as the lodge responded. Corridors folded into each other, doors appeared and vanished, shadows surged like a black tide. The whispers, now almost unbearable, pressed directly on his mind, yet Ethan held firm, forcing his will, forcing his acknowledgement, forcing the lodge to see him as separate, as unclaimed, as defiant. The shadows recoiled slightly. The faceless figures froze mid-motion. The central figure rippled again, slowly, deliberately, its presence pressing into him, testing, gauging, yet pausing. The dragging sound from deep within the lodge slowed, almost hesitant, echoing as if waiting. For a fleeting moment, the impossible, eternal lodge seemed uncertain, and Ethan realized the power of his defiance, the force of acknowledgement, the importance of standing his ground within this living nightmare. Step by step, breath by ragged breath, he pressed closer to the heart, surrounded by shadows, faceless figures, impossible architecture, and the pulsing presence of the central figure. He understood that to survive, to endure, he had to confront the lodge not as a victim, but as a participant in this impossible, eternal game, facing the living darkness with courage, defiance, and the unshakable knowledge of his own identity. Ethan's knees burned from exhaustion, his lungs heaving with every ragged breath, but he refused to falter. The chamber around him throbbed with a living pulse, the central figure looming impossibly above, faceless yet aware, tendrils of shadow reaching out like probing fingers. The faceless figures along the walls swayed closer, twisting in unnatural angles, their forms stretching impossibly, bending in ways that made his stomach lurch. Shadows surged along the floors and walls, pooling and curling like liquid black, pressing against him, probing, testing, suffocating. Then it began. The lodge invaded his mind. The whispers no longer whispered, they screamed in waves of thought and memory, threading through every corner of his consciousness, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. See, witness, remain, belong, surrender, fail, fear, die. Each word struck him like a blow, conjuring visions he could not escape. In the shadows, he saw himself twisted, broken, faceless, collapsing into darkness. The faceless figures mirrored him, moving with malicious imitation, bending their limbs as though mocking every flaw, every fear he had ever carried. The central figure pulsed violently, and the shadows erupted in waves, lunging at him in synchronized attack. Tendrils wrapped around his chest, arms, legs pulling, constricting, pressing into him with unrelenting force. Pain shot through his body, muscles straining as he staggered, yet he forced himself upright. His voice cut through the rising tide of whispers. I will remain myself. I am not yours. Lightning flashed, illuminating the chamber in stark, terrifying detail. Hundreds of faceless figures swarmed the walls, their shadows climbing higher, coiling tighter, reaching for him with intent. The lodge itself shivered and shifted, corridors folding into one another, floors undulating, doors appearing and vanishing. Every pulse, every vibration, every surge of shadows was a test, a measure of endurance, a probe into his courage. Then the visions began to twist more sharply, more cruelly. He saw himself falling endlessly down corridors that twisted impossibly, rooms stretching into infinity. He saw friends and family screaming from faceless mouths, reaching toward him, imploring him to surrender. The shadows mirrored his every move, becoming darker, more aggressive, almost sentient in their replication. The central figure pulsed, and the walls of the chamber seemed to breathe, stretching closer, folding inward, pressing against him, the whispers slicing into his mind like knives. Face it, belong, witness, fail, remain, forever, submit, endure, surrender. Ethan's mind screamed in defiance. He forced his shaking legs to move, stepping forward into the heart of the lodge, into the pulsing darkness, surrounded by shadows that lashed, wrapped, constricted. He forced himself to see clearly, to acknowledge the faceless figures, the pulsing tendrils, the impossible living architecture. I am still me, he thought, gripping the fragile edge of sanity like a lifeline. I remain myself. I'm not yours. The central figure responded, pulsing violently, sending waves of shadow through the chamber, warping reality. The floor rose and fell beneath him, stretching impossibly, curving upward like a living wave. The walls twisted, forming new corridors, new doors that led nowhere, folding in on themselves as though the lodge itself were alive and breathing around him. Shadows lunged in synchronized waves, climbing along his body, pressing into him, cold and clammy, probing every weakness. The visions intensified. He saw endless reflections of himself, broken, faceless, twisted into shapes of horror, each one mimicking his fear, his exhaustion, his terror. The lodge whispered relentlessly, cutting deeper. Fail, remain, surrender, join, belong, die, witness, forever. Pain lanced through his chest as shadows constricted tighter, yet he forced himself upright, driving forward with every ounce of willpower. Each step was agony, yet he moved, defiant, resisting the lodge's attempts to erase him, to bend him, to claim him. Lightning flashed, illuminating the chamber and revealing hundreds of faceless figures swarming toward him. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, their shadows coiling, wrapping, lunging, testing, pressing. The central figure pulsed again, sending waves of shadow so powerful they seemed to tear at reality itself. The corridors outside folded impossibly, ceilings stretching higher, floors curving downward, doors appearing and vanishing as though the lodge were reshaping space to trap him. Ethan shouted over the roar of whispers and the surge of shadows, I will remain myself. I will not be yours. I confront you. Pain, exhaustion, and terror surged through him, but the act of defiance created a pause. The shadows recoiled slightly. The faceless figures froze mid-motion. The central figure rippled violently as though acknowledging his resolve. The lodge itself seemed momentarily hesitant, the corridors folding slower, the shadows twisting with less certainty. Step by agonizing step, breath by ragged breath, Ethan pressed closer to the heart of the lodge, surrounded by shadows, faceless figures, and impossible architecture. He realized that to endure he could not just resist, he had to confront, to acknowledge, to face the lodge as an equal, not a victim. Every heartbeat, every breath, every step was a declaration. He remained himself. He was not claimed. He would not surrender. The whispers softened slightly, threaded through the shadows like fragile tendrils. See, witness, remain, belong, endure, survive. Face it, remain, forever. Ethan pressed forward, moving into the center of the pulsing darkness, his mind and body trembling, the lodge alive, eternal, hungry, yet momentarily hesitant. Ethan stood at the center of the lodge's heart, chest burning, lungs ragged, muscles trembling, yet he did not fall. The shadows coiled and lunged like living predators, faceless figures swaying and bending in impossible angles, yet something had changed. For the first time, the central figure pulsed and hesitated, tendrils of darkness writhing, rippling outward but pausing as though measuring his defiance. The whispers, previously a cacophony, now threaded through his mind in sharp, deliberate strikes. See, witness, remain, belong, endure, survive, confront, remain, forever. Ethan's mind screamed in defiance. I remain myself. I'm not yours. I confront you. The words echoed through the chamber, reverberating against walls that folded and twisted impossibly, corridors bending and stretching like liquid. The shadows recoiled slightly, faceless figures froze mid-motion, and the central figure pulsed violently, almost as though it recognized his intent. The lodge itself vibrated, alive, sensing that its prey was no longer merely fleeing but resisting, confronting, and surviving. The hallucinations intensified, visions of fear, despair, and endless corridors twisting into infinity filling his mind. He saw himself fragmented, multiplied, broken into endless reflections, faceless, screaming, reaching toward him. Shadows rose along the walls, dripping like black rivers, crawling over his legs, arms, torso, attempting to overwhelm him. Yet Ethan forced each step forward, forcing his gaze through the terror, refusing to let the lodge claim him. I remain myself. I will not be yours, he shouted, voice breaking but defiant. The central figure rippled again, sending waves of shadows that pulsed like living water. They crashed against him, coiling tighter, pressing into his chest, arms, and legs, yet each step he took pushed them back. The lodge was alive, and for the first time it was being challenged. The faceless figures mirrored his movements, hesitated, recoiled slightly, and shadows twisted in response to the force of his will. Lightning flashed through cracks in the warped ceiling, illuminating hundreds of faceless figures in the corners, limbs bent impossibly, shadows reaching outward, yet all movement seemed slightly delayed, hesitant, as though the lodge were adapting, responding, learning from his defiance. The dragging sound echoed again, but slower now, resonating like a heartbeat that measured endurance rather than immediate attack. Ethan pressed onward, each step a declaration, each breath a defiance, each movement a claim of identity in the heart of this living nightmare. Then came the visions. They surged harder than ever before. He saw endless versions of himself, broken, faceless, screaming, twisting, multiplying into infinity. He saw friends and family he loved, their faces blurred and twisted into horrific masks, reaching toward him with silent pleas. He saw rooms stretching impossibly into blackness, corridors looping back upon themselves, ceilings folding down to crush him, floors rising to block his path. Shadows lunged and coiled, wrapping tighter with each hallucination, yet he forced himself to see clearly. None of this owns me. I'm still me. I confront you. The central figure pulsed violently, responding to the clarity and force of his will. Shadows surged outward but then recoiled when he stepped forward, tendrils uncoiling just enough for him to move. The faceless figures froze, swayed, hesitated, and the lodge's architecture warped in impossible ways, folding and stretching as though considering his defiance. He realized that the lodge was testing him, not merely attacking, measuring his courage, endurance, and resolve, pushing him toward the limits of mind and body. Pain lanced through him as the shadows tightened around his chest, arms, legs, yet he forced himself upright, voice rising above the whispers. I will remain myself. I will not be yours. I confront you. The central figure rippled violently in response, and the lodge shuddered, corridors folding in impossible spirals, ceilings stretching higher, floors curving, doors appearing and vanishing as the very building itself responded to the force of his defiance. For a moment, the lodge seemed uncertain. Shadows recoiled slightly, faceless figures froze mid-motion, and the central figure pulsed in deliberate, measured intervals. The whispers, once deafening, softened slightly, threading through the darkness like fragile tendrils. See, witness, remain, endure, confront, survive, belong, forever. Ethan pressed forward, breath by ragged breath, step by agonizing step, forcing himself into the pulsing heart of the lodge, surrounded by shadows, faceless figures, and impossible, twisting architecture. The hallucination struck again, this time more violently. Endless corridors stretched into infinity, impossible doors opened to voids that threatened to swallow him whole, faceless figures multiplied and mirrored his every fear, shadows coiled around him in cold, crushing waves. Yet he stepped forward. He forced himself to confront each vision, acknowledge it, yet not surrender. I am myself. I endure. I face you. I remain. The central figure pulsed, shadows surged and recoiled, and for the first time, a slight gap appeared, a space in the darkness just large enough to step further toward the heart. The lodge responded, testing, adjusting, bending reality around him, but the hesitation was real. Ethan understood. His defiance had carved a space, a path, a possibility. The shadows pressed, the faceless figures swayed, but he moved, unbroken, unclaimed, confronting the eternal darkness. Step by step, breath by ragged breath, he pressed deeper into the lodge, toward the central figure, toward the pulsing heart, surrounded by living shadows, faceless figures, and impossible architecture. He realized with cold, burning clarity that to survive he must confront, endure, and persist, not merely flee, not merely resist, but actively face the lodge, claim his will, and assert his identity against the eternal, living nightmare. Ethan's legs trembled beneath him, muscles screaming from exhaustion, but he refused to falter. The heart of the lodge pulsed around him, tendrils of darkness rippling outward in waves that seemed almost alive. Shadows lashed at him, coiling around his arms, legs, and chest, yet he forced his steps forward, each one a declaration of defiance. The faceless figures along the walls swayed in unnatural harmony, bending and twisting in ways that defied reality, Yet they paused, hesitated, as though sensing a change in the balance of power. The whispers that had once been a cacophony now threaded through his mind in sharper, more deliberate tones. See, witness, endure, confront, remain, belong, survive, face it, forever. Each word sliced into his consciousness, but instead of breaking him, they galvanized him. Ethan forced his shaking body upright, voice rising through the oppressive chamber. I am myself. I will not belong to you. I face you. The central figure pulsed violently in response. Shadows erupted outward in violent waves, lashing, twisting, coiling around him like living chains. Yet every surge that came from the lodge met the force of his defiance. He pressed forward, each step bending the shadows back, forcing gaps in the coiling darkness. For the first time he felt that the lodge, this sentient, eternal predator, was not entirely untouchable, that it reacted to his will, that his presence, his recognition, his defiance mattered. The hallucinations intensified, striking at him with terrifying precision. He saw himself splintered, multiplied into hundreds of faceless, screaming reflections, their twisted forms mirroring every fear and insecurity he had ever carried. He saw loved ones' faces, distorted, screaming, imploring him to surrender. Entire corridors stretched and folded into infinity, doors appeared to nowhere, ceilings pressed down to crush him, floors rippled beneath his feet. Shadows wrapped around him in icy coils, tightening, lashing, climbing higher, yet Ethan forced his gaze forward. He acknowledged the visions without surrender, naming the truth in his mind. I remain myself. I endure. I confront. I survive. The central figure pulsed again, larger waves of shadow crashing outward. Faceless figures lunged, their movements perfectly synchronized, yet with every surge Ethan felt a new clarity. The lodge's attacks were no longer entirely unopposed. They bent, hesitated, recoiled slightly. He realized that his acknowledgement, his confrontation, his refusal to surrender, was shaping the lodge's reaction. For the first time, he saw space open before him, corridors bending to allow movement, shadows pausing before striking, faceless figures freezing mid-lunge. Pain lanced through him as the shadows pressed harder, but he forced himself upright, forcing words through teeth clenched in exhaustion. I will remain myself. Confront you. I will not belong to you. The central figure pulsed violently, rippling across the chamber, and the lodge itself seemed to quiver, the impossible corridors and floors undulating with tension. The faceless figures hesitated mid-motion, shadows coiled but then stretched less aggressively. The lodge's pulse, its rhythm, seemed to sync partially with his defiance, as though testing his endurance, measuring his mind, weighing his will against its eternal presence. Then came the visions of despair. Ethan saw himself crumpled and broken, faceless, falling endlessly through corridors that twisted infinitely, shadows coiling around him like black water, faceless figures mimicking every move, every fear, multiplying without end. He saw loved ones screaming in silent agony, reaching for him yet turning away, stretching into impossible shapes. The whispers slashed into his mind, relentless. Surrender, belong, remain, fail, forever, join, witness, submit, die. But Ethan pressed forward, forcing each step with trembling legs, forcing breath into his burning lungs, forcing defiance into his mind. I am myself. I endure. I face this. I confront you. Shadows struck, tendrils coiling, yet each strike met resistance, not from strength but from sheer, unwavering will. The faceless figures swayed but paused, mirrored but recoiled slightly, the lodge responding to his clarity, his recognition, his assertion of self against its eternal hunger. Lightning flashed, illuminating hundreds of faceless figures, the coiling shadows, the twisting corridors. The lodge shuddered, folding upon itself, bending reality, yet gaps appeared. Gaps he could step through. The central figure pulsed violently once more, shadows surging in waves, yet he could see them bending, stretching, recoiling in response to him. For the first time he felt a fragile, terrifying, exhilarating truth. The lodge, eternal, sentient, all-consuming, could be influenced, if only by the force of will, by recognition, by confrontation. Step by agonizing step, breath by ragged breath, Ethan pressed into the pulsing heart of the lodge, the shadows writhing and coiling around him, the faceless figures swaying, the corridors folding impossibly. The vision struck again, more vivid, more horrifying, yet he acknowledged each one, each fear, each hallucination, and pressed onward. I remain. I confront. I endure. I survive. The lodge responded, the shadows bending slightly, the faceless figures hesitating, the impossible architecture yielding just enough for him to move forward. Ethan realized something monumental. His will, his defiance, his recognition of self against this eternal nightmare was beginning to break the lodge's hold. Every step, every word, every breath of defiance forced a reaction, a hesitation, a fracture in the endless, all-consuming darkness. For the first time there was a path, a narrow, terrifying, impossibly thin path, through the heart of the lodge. Ethan's knees burned, muscles trembling violently, lungs screaming with every ragged breath, yet he forced himself forward. The lodge pulsed around him, a living nightmare of twisting corridors, shifting floors, coiling shadows, and faceless figures swaying in impossible synchrony. The central figure loomed above, limbs bending in unnatural angles, tendrils of darkness writhing like living serpents. But for the first time, Ethan felt that the lodge was not absolute. Its reality-warping power, its suffocating presence, its infinite, all-consuming hunger, these could be influenced, bent, challenged, if only he maintained his defiance and clarity of mind. "I am myself. I remain. I'll confront you," he shouted, voice cracking yet firm, cutting through the endless whispers. The shadows recoiled slightly, as though startled by the force of his acknowledgement. The faceless figures hesitated mid-motion, their movements faltering for the first time in endless hours, or perhaps days, inside this impossible space. The central figure rippled violently, tendrils lashing outward, yet even they recoiled, curling slightly at his approach. The hallucination struck, more vivid and terrifying than ever. Endless versions of himself splintered across the warped corridors, faceless, screaming, reaching, twisting, multiplying into infinity. Shadows rose like living water, coiling around his legs and arms, pressing into his chest, attempting to suffocate him. The whispers screamed, "Surrender, belong, fail, remain, witness, forever, join, die." But Ethan did something new. He acknowledged the hallucinations without fear, naming them, recognizing them as extensions of the lodge's power and not reality itself. "You are not real. I am real. I remain myself," he roared, forcing his mind into sharp focus. The shadows quivered, the faceless figures froze, and the lodge itself seemed to hesitate, its pulse wavering. For the first time, Ethan felt agency. He could move through the lodge not merely by surviving its attacks, but by confronting and bending them. He stretched out a trembling hand toward a coiling shadow, and to his shock, it paused, hesitated, almost as if waiting for his intent. With a trembling breath, he forced the thought, "Step aside." The shadow unwound, coiling upward, leaving a small path open through the twisting, impossible floor. The faceless figures along the walls mirrored him but did not move to block him. The central figure pulsed violently, yet a gap appeared between its tendrils, a small fracture in the eternal darkness. Heart hammering, Ethan pressed further, moving through the lodge with a newfound rhythm. Every step he took, every breath he drew forced reactions. Shadows twisted and recoiled, faceless figures hesitated, hallucinations splintered and fragmented as he acknowledged them, naming each fear and confronting it directly. "I see you. I remain. You do not own me." The lodge pulsed in rhythm with him, as though learning, adjusting, responding to his will. Lightning flashed through the warped ceiling, illuminating the chamber. Hundreds of faceless figures swarmed the edges, coiling shadows crawling along walls and floors, yet now he could see openings, gaps where he could move. The lodge's pulse was still overwhelming, yet he felt something inside himself awaken. A fragile, terrifying, exhilarating sense that he could bend this nightmare to his will. Each step forward became a negotiation, a dialogue with the eternal darkness, rather than a desperate fight for survival. Then the central figure pulsed violently, larger waves of shadow surging outward like living waves. Ethan staggered but raised his arms, forcing his recognition into the darkness. "I remain myself. I am not yours. I confront you. I endure." The waves of shadow recoiled slightly, the tendrils curling back, the faceless figures froze, and the impossible corridors of the lodge folded slower, bending to allow him movement. The hallucinations of despair, the endless versions of himself, the twisted loved ones, the infinite corridors, bent at his acknowledgement, each step of defiance carving space, fracturing the lodge's hold on his mind. Pain shot through him as shadows coiled tighter, yet he pressed on, moving step by step into the heart of the lodge. He realized the central figure's power depended entirely on fear, on submission, on surrender. By refusing all of it, by acknowledging reality for what it was and his mind for what it was, he began to force the lodge to bend, shaping the impossible space around him, bending shadows and illusions, creating paths where none existed. Lightning flashed again, illuminating hundreds of faceless figures, each paused, each hesitant, each waiting, observing, reacting. Ethan pressed on, and for the first time, the pulse of the lodge seemed partially synchronized with his own heartbeat. Shadows lunged, yet recoiled. Hallucinations screamed, yet fragmented. The central figure rippled violently, yet a narrow path opened before him, an impossible corridor bending toward the pulsing heart. Step by step, breath by ragged breath, Ethan moved through the lodge, bending reality with the sheer force of will, confronting every hallucination, twisting every shadow to create space, fracturing the eternal darkness just enough to move. He realized with icy clarity that survival was no longer just endurance. It was agency, defiance, confrontation, and recognition. The lodge had been unchallenged for eternity, feeding on fear and surrender, yet now it faced something new. A conscious will, unbroken, asserting itself against the impossible, eternal darkness. Ethan stood at the threshold of the central figure's pulse, every muscle in his body screaming with exhaustion, every breath a struggle, yet he did not falter. The shadows that had coiled around him like living chains now twisted and swayed in rhythm with his movements, revealing gaps and corridors that had never existed before. The faceless figures along the walls paused, bending and swaying as though uncertain of how to respond, while the central figure loomed above, limbs twisting in impossible angles, faceless, eternal, and aware. The whispers that had once drowned him in madness now threaded through his mind like sharpened, deliberate voices. See, witness, endure, confront, remain, survive, face it, forever, bend, defy. Each word struck, yet this time they did not break him. They focused him. Ethan's mind sharpened, clarity cutting through fear, exhaustion, and despair. I remain myself. Confront you. I will not belong to you. His voice rang out, resonant, shaking the chamber, cutting through the thick, suffocating darkness. The central figure pulsed violently, and shadows exploded outward in waves, yet they recoiled slightly as if uncertain. The faceless figures along the edges mirrored his defiance, hesitating mid-motion, and the impossible corridors of the lodge bent in ways that created narrow, twisting paths leading directly toward the heart. For the first time, Ethan felt control, small but undeniable, over the eternal nightmare that had seemed absolute. Visions of despair struck him harder than ever. Endless versions of himself, faceless and screaming, multiplied across corridors that stretched into infinity. Shadows coiled along floors and walls, climbing higher, pressing into him with suffocating weight. Loved ones appeared, distorted into masks of horror, screaming in silence, their faces twisted with fear and pleading. The whispers surged, clawing at his mind. Surrender, belong, fail, remain, forever, join, die, will witness, submit. Ethan forced his mind to clarity. He acknowledged the visions, naming each fear, each hallucination, each distorted version of reality, and refused to surrender. You are not real. I am real. I remain myself. I confront you. The shadows flinched at his acknowledgement, the faceless figures froze, and the lodge itself seemed to hesitate. The central figure pulsed violently, its tendrils lashing outward, yet each lash met resistance, bending slightly away as though recognizing the force of his will. He stepped forward, each movement deliberate, conscious, focused. With a trembling hand, he reached toward a coiling shadow. Step aside, he commanded, and to his shock, it did, curling upward to reveal a path through the shifting floors. The faceless figures hesitated, and the central figure rippled in recognition, observing him as he pressed closer. Every step became a negotiation, a battle of agency against eternal darkness, as Ethan realized that the lodge responded to force of mind, recognition, and defiance. Lightning flashed through the warped ceiling, illuminating hundreds of faceless figures, coiling shadows, and twisting corridors. The lodge trembled in response to him, a living, sentient structure bending partially to his will. Shadows lunged, yet recoiled. Hallucinations screamed, yet splintered. The central figure pulsed, yet a narrow corridor opened, bending impossibly toward the pulsing heart. For the first time, Ethan felt that escape, or perhaps confrontation, was possible. Then the central figure pulsed violently again, tendrils striking outward with renewed aggression. Pain shot through Ethan's chest, arms, and legs as shadows coiled tighter, yet he forced himself upright, forcing every breath, every step, every thought into defiance. I remain myself. Confront you. Endure. I survive. The tendrils recoiled slightly, faceless figures froze, and the lodge's pulse rhythm adjusted, almost as if syncing partially with his heartbeat. The whispers softened, threading like fragile tendrils. See, witness, endure, remain, confront, survive, forever. Ethan pressed forward, step by agonizing step, breath by ragged breath, bending shadows with the sheer force of recognition, fracturing hallucinations with acknowledgement, and creating impossible space in the heart of the lodge. He realized that the central figure's power relied on fear, surrender, and acceptance. By refusing all of it, by confronting the eternal darkness head-on, he could begin to bend it to his will. Lightning flashed again, illuminating hundreds of faceless figures, coiling shadows crawling along walls and floors, yet now he could see openings, paths that had never existed. The lodge's pulse, once overwhelming and suffocating, now responded partially to his own force of will. Shadows twisted and coiled, then shifted aside. Hallucinations bent and fragmented. The central figure loomed, aware, observing, and for the first time vulnerable, not invincible, not absolute, but a force that could be challenged. Step by step, breath by ragged breath, Ethan pressed deeper into the heart, bending reality, shadows, and hallucinations around him, confronting the central figure and claiming agency in a nightmare that had once seemed eternal and absolute. He understood, with burning clarity, that survival was not merely endurance. It was confrontation, recognition, defiance, and the unyielding assertion of self against the impossible darkness. Ethan's legs burned, muscles trembling, every fiber of his being screaming with exhaustion, but he pressed onward. The heart of the lodge pulsed around him, shadows coiling, twisting, writhing like living serpents, faceless figures swaying along the warped walls in impossible angles. Above him, the central figure loomed, faceless, eternal, aware, tendrils lashing outward like the branches of some colossal, nightmarish tree. Yet now Ethan felt a glimmer of something new: control. Not complete control, not yet, but the faint, terrifying sense that his will could influence the lodge itself. The whispers that had filled his mind for endless hours now threaded through him in deliberate, sharpened words. See, witness, endure, confront, remain, survive, bend, defy, shape. He clutched the raw power of his focus, forcing himself to speak aloud. I am myself. I remain. Confront you. I shape this darkness. Shadows recoiled slightly at the force of his acknowledgement. The faceless figures froze mid-motion. The lodge pulsed violently, yet cracks appeared in the endless, living darkness, subtle spaces opening for him to advance. The hallucination struck harder than ever. Endless versions of himself, faceless and screaming, multiplied across infinite corridors. Shadows coiled like black rivers, climbing higher, wrapping around every inch of the twisted floors and ceilings. The faceless loved ones appeared, their faces twisted in horror and silent pleas. Yet Ethan forced recognition, naming each illusion, confronting each fear directly. You are not real. I am real. I remain myself. I confront you. I shape this nightmare. The lodge pulsed violently, yet for the first time, the visions fractured, bending around him instead of suffocating him entirely. He lifted a trembling hand toward a coiling shadow, willing it to move aside. The darkness obeyed, twisting and recoiling, revealing a path. Another shadow lunged at his chest, tendrils coiling tight, but he forced it to unravel with sheer force of will. Step by step, breath by ragged breath, he pressed forward. Every hallucination, every shadow, every faceless figure now hesitated, paused, or fractured in reaction to his defiance. The central figure above pulsed violently, yet Ethan felt its rhythm beginning to sync partially with his own heartbeat. Lightning split the warped ceiling, illuminating hundreds of faceless figures frozen in impossible angles, shadows twisting and coiling across the chamber like black water. The lodge groaned, a sound that resonated through his chest, yet he realized that it was responding, bending, shaping, yielding, because he refused to succumb. He forced himself to take another step into the pulsing heart, voice rising over the whispers. I am myself. I remain. I confront you. I endure. I shape this darkness. The central figure pulsed violently, tendrils lashing outward in synchronized waves, yet Ethan reached out, forcing his mind into the lodge itself. Shadows recoiled, twisting aside, coiling differently, responding to his intent. The faceless figures mirrored his stance but no longer attacked. Some froze, some staggered, some simply paused as though unsure of their role. He realized the lodge had never faced someone willing to engage, willing to confront, willing to bend its power rather than flee from it. The hallucinations intensified, yet with each wave Ethan forced acknowledgement. Endless corridors folded into themselves, ceilings pressed down, floors rippled like water, yet he bent the movement with the sheer force of recognition. Faceless figures multiplied, yet he fractured them with thought. You are not me. You are not real. I remain myself. Shadows surged like rivers, yet he carved pathways through them, bending them with intent. For the first time he realized he could shape the lodge, not fully, not permanently, but enough to survive, enough to move, enough to confront the central figure directly. Lightning flashed again, revealing the central figure in stark clarity. Limbs twisted in angles that should have been impossible, tendrils writhing like living ink, the pulse of darkness radiating outward. Yet Ethan felt the hesitation, the slight recoil, the uncertainty, the acknowledgement of his presence, his will, his refusal to surrender. Shadows twisted before his eyes, bending upward, curling away. Hallucinations splintered and fractured. The lodge groaned and shifted, corridors bending to create a narrow, winding path into the very heart of the pulsing figure. Step by agonizing step, breath by ragged breath, Ethan pressed deeper into the lodge's heart. Pain shot through his body, shadows coiled tight, hallucinations screamed, faceless figures loomed, but he pressed onward. Every movement, every breath, every act of defiance bent the lodge slightly, shaping shadows, fracturing illusions, creating a path where none should exist. For the first time, he understood that the lodge's eternal power depended on fear and surrender. By refusing both, by bending shadows with acknowledgement and will, he could force even the central figure to react, to hesitate, to yield space, to allow confrontation. The central figure pulsed violently, sending waves of darkness in every direction, yet gaps opened. Shadows uncoiled. Faceless figures froze or staggered. Hallucinations fractured and twisted away, unable to maintain coherence in the face of Ethan's focused defiance. Step by step, he moved closer to the pulsing heart, feeling a terrible exhilaration. The lodge was not absolute. The eternal darkness was not invincible. His mind, his recognition, his defiance, his will, these were weapons against it. Ethan realized with burning clarity that survival was not merely endurance. It was recognition, confrontation, defiance, and shaping the very nightmare itself. Every step forward was a negotiation, a battle of wills, a claim of identity against an eternal living darkness. The lodge, unchallenged for what must have been centuries, was bending to the force of a single human will for the first time in its existence. Ethan's body burned with exhaustion, muscles trembling violently, lungs heaving with ragged breaths, yet he pressed forward. The lodge's pulse throbbed around him like a living heartbeat, shadows writhing like serpents, faceless figures swaying in impossible angles, tendrils of darkness stretching outward, probing, testing, waiting. Above him, the central figure loomed, faceless, eternal, aware, limbs twisting and contorting in impossible geometries, tendrils lashing outward with lethal intent. Yet Ethan felt something new, not mere survival, not temporary respite, but the terrifying sense that he could confront and shape this eternal darkness. The whispers that had haunted him for endless hours now threaded through his mind in deliberate, sharpened syllables. See, witness, endure, confront, remain, survive, bend, defy, shape, control. He clutched the power of his focus and forced the words aloud. I am myself. I remain. Confront you. Bend this darkness. I shape it to my will. Shadows recoiled, faceless figures froze mid-motion, and the central figure pulsed violently, its tendrils striking outward, yet hesitated as gaps opened in the writhing blackness. The hallucinations struck harder than ever, visions of despair intensified to unimaginable extremes. Endless versions of himself, faceless and screaming, multiplied infinitely through corridors that stretched into infinity, wrapping around every angle of the warped lodge. Shadows rose from the floors and walls like tidal waves, wrapping around his limbs, pressing into his chest and throat. Faceless loved ones appeared, their faces twisted in impossible horror, their silent pleas cutting into his mind. The whispers surged in vicious crescendo. Surrender, belong, fail, remain, forever, join, die, or witness, submit. Ethan forced recognition, naming each illusion, each fear, each splinter of the lodge's power. You are not real. I am real. I remain myself. I confront you. I shape this nightmare. The shadows recoiled, the faceless figures froze, and the lodge pulsed violently in acknowledgement. The hallucinations fractured and bent around him instead of crushing him, corridors warped but open to his will, and tendrils of darkness now twisted instead of striking, responding to his defiance rather than attacking blindly. He reached out a trembling hand toward a coiling shadow, willing it to move aside, and it did, uncoiling with a strange, fluid obedience. Another tendril struck at his chest, cold and suffocating, yet he forced it to unravel with sheer focus and intent. Step by agonizing step, breath by ragged breath, he moved deeper into the heart of the lodge. Each movement bent the impossible architecture, fractured hallucinations, and carved paths through shadows where none should exist. Lightning flashed through the warped ceiling, illuminating the central figure in stark relief. Limbs twisted and contorted, tendrils lashing outward, yet the gaps widened. The faceless figures along the edges froze, staggered, or recoiled. Shadows that had once been unbreakable chains now twisted aside at Ethan's will. The lodge groaned, corridors folding, floors undulating, ceilings stretching impossibly high, all bending to the force of his defiance and recognition. Pain seared through his body as shadows coiled tighter and hallucinations screamed in vivid terror, yet Ethan pressed onward. Every breath, every word, every movement became an assertion of self, a negotiation with the eternal darkness, a claim of agency in a place that had once seemed invincible. I am myself. I endure. I confront. I shape this darkness. Shadows lashed, then bent. Hallucinations screamed, then fractured. The central figure pulsed violently, yet a narrow, winding corridor now opened toward its pulsing heart. Ethan realized a terrifying truth. The lodge's eternal power relied on fear, surrender, and submission. By refusing all three, by bending shadows with intent and fracturing hallucinations with acknowledgement, he could force even the central figure to react, to hesitate, to yield space, and perhaps, for the first time in eternity, be challenged. The pulse of the lodge synchronized partially with his heartbeat. The whispering faded into a tense silence threaded with acknowledgement. See, witness, endure, remain, confront, survive, forever. Step by step, he advanced, shaping shadows, bending illusions, fracturing the faceless figure's synchronized attacks. The lodge reacted violently but inconsistently, each pulse sending waves of darkness that twisted, recoiled, and bent. The central figure loomed above, observing, rippling in violent acknowledgement of Ethan's defiance. Every heartbeat, every breath of defiance, carved a new path through the nightmare, a narrow path through the impossible darkness, leading toward confrontation. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the chamber and hundreds of faceless figures frozen mid-lunge. Shadows twisted and coiled like black rivers, yet gaps widened before him. Hallucinations splintered and fractured, unable to maintain cohesion against the force of his recognition. Tendrils of darkness lashed outward but bent aside at his will. Step by agonizing step, breath by ragged breath, Ethan pressed deeper into the lodge's pulsing heart, realizing with chilling clarity that survival was no longer endurance alone. It was defiance, recognition, confrontation, and shaping the eternal darkness itself. He could feel the lodge bending, testing, uncertain, alive in a way it had never been. The central figure pulsed violently, yet the spaces opened. Shadows recoiled and twisted. Hallucinations fractured. Corridors folded to create impossible paths, all responding to his defiance. For the first time, Ethan realized that the lodge, eternal, sentient, and terrifying, could be influenced, bent, even challenged. The nightmare was no longer absolute. It could be confronted fully with mind, body, and will. Ethan's body screamed in protest, every muscle trembling, lungs burning, yet he pressed forward. The lodge's pulse reverberated around him like a living drum, shadows writhing like rivers of ink, faceless figures swaying in impossible angles along the warped walls. Tendrils of darkness lashed outward with lethal intent, probing, testing, measuring, yet he no longer merely endured. They bent, twisted, and recoiled at the force of his will. Above him, the central figure loomed, faceless and eternal, observing, aware, reacting to every heartbeat, every breath, every deliberate step. The whispers had grown quieter, threading through his mind in sharp, deliberate fragments. See, witness, endure, confront, remain, survive, bend, defy, shape, control. Each word, once suffocating, now reinforced him. Ethan's focus sharpened until it was a blade cutting through the impossible chaos. He forced himself to speak aloud. I am myself. I remain. I confront you. Bend this darkness. I shape it. I control it. The shadows recoiled, tendrils curling, faceless figures froze mid-motion, and the central figure pulsed violently but hesitated. The hallucination struck with renewed intensity. Endless versions of himself, faceless and screaming, multiplied infinitely through the twisting corridors. Shadows climbed walls and ceilings, coiling around him, pressing against chest and legs. Twisted visions of loved ones screamed silently, their faces distorted in impossible ways. The whispers escalated. Surrender, belong, fail, remain, forever, join, die, witness, submit. Ethan forced his recognition. You are not real. I am real. I remain myself. I confront you. I bend you. I control this darkness. The lodge reacted instantly. Shadows twisted, bending, splitting away to form paths instead of crushing him. Faceless figures staggered, then froze entirely. Hallucinations fractured into shards of distorted forms. The central figure's pulse rippled violently, tendrils thrashing outward, yet now he could manipulate them with intention, bending them aside, forcing them to leave gaps. Step by agonizing step, breath by ragged breath, he pressed forward, the impossible corridors bending to his will. Floors that had undulated like waves now shifted to form paths. Ceilings folded, creating bridges. Shadows coiled and uncoiled, shaping themselves into walls, gaps, or barriers, entirely responsive to his intent. The hallucinations of despair, once relentless, now splintered when he confronted them, unable to maintain cohesion against his focused acknowledgement. Lightning flashed, illuminating the central figure and hundreds of faceless figures frozen in impossible postures. Tendrils of darkness lashed, shadows writhing in turbulent currents, yet gaps widened, corridors twisted to allow passage, and hallucinations broke apart with each step. The lodge groaned, a sound like 1,000 voices in pain, yet it shifted in response to his force of will. For the first time, Ethan realized he was no longer merely surviving. He was shaping the nightmare itself. Pain lanced through his body as shadows coiled tighter and hallucinations screamed louder, but he pressed onward, each movement an assertion of defiance. Every breath, every word, every deliberate act shaped the lodge around him. I am myself. I endure. I confront. I bend this darkness. I control it. Shadows recoiled at the command, tendrils twisting aside, hallucinations fractured, faceless figures froze in acknowledgement of his power. The central figure pulsed violently, yet a winding path opened directly toward its heart. Ethan understood a terrifying, exhilarating truth. The lodge's eternal, all-consuming power had relied entirely on fear, surrender, and submission. By refusing all three and bending its shadows, shaping its illusions, fracturing its hallucinations, he could force the eternal figure to respond, to hesitate, to yield space, and perhaps, for the first time in its existence, be challenged and confronted directly. Step by step, breath by ragged breath, he pressed into the lodge's heart. Shadows bent completely to his will, coiling now as walls, barriers, or bridges as he needed. Hallucinations fractured instantly at acknowledgement, splintering into fragments he could walk around or shape. Faceless figures paused, staggered, and froze. Corridors warped and folded in impossible but navigable paths. The pulse of the lodge began to sync almost rhythmically with his heartbeat, a recognition of a new force, a defiance it had never encountered. Lightning split the warped ceiling, illuminating the central figure looming above, limbs twisting in impossible angles, tendrils writhing like rivers of living ink. Yet gaps widened. Shadows twisted aside. Hallucinations fractured. The lodge groaned in recognition of his power. For the first time, Ethan realized the horrifying and exhilarating truth. He could directly confront the central figure, shaping the eternal nightmare into a battlefield where his will, mind, and defiance mattered. Step by agonizing step, breath by ragged breath, he moved closer, the impossible corridors bending perfectly to his intent, shadows molding to create a path, hallucinations fracturing at his recognition, faceless figures frozen in acknowledgement. The pulsing heart of the lodge, once absolute, was now negotiable, malleable, responsive to the force of a single human will. Ethan's lips cracked as he whispered, voice raw but unwavering, I'll control you. I'll shape this darkness. I'll confront you fully. I am myself. The central figure pulsed violently, tendrils lashing outward one final time, yet gaps opened, shadows twisted completely aside, hallucinations shattered, and the path to confrontation stretched before him, impossible yet achievable. Ethan's body burned with exhaustion, every muscle trembling, lungs heaving like bellows, yet he pressed forward. The lodge's pulse throbbed around him, a living heartbeat, shadows writhing like black serpents, faceless figures frozen in impossible angles, tendrils of darkness lashing outward, probing, testing, measuring. Above him, the central figure loomed, faceless, eternal, limbs twisting in geometries that defied reason, tendrils writhing and coiling like liquid night. And for the first time, Ethan felt not merely survival, not merely defiance, but agency. A terrifying, exhilarating force that could bend the eternal darkness itself. The whispers that had clawed at his mind for hours, days, perhaps centuries now, were quieter, fragmented, threading through him with tentative syllables. See, endure, confront, remain, survive, bend, defy, shape, control. Each word, once suffocating, now bolstered his clarity. He forced them into speech. I am myself. I remain. Confront you. Bend this darkness. I shape it. I control it. Shadows recoiled, tendrils twisted aside, faceless figures froze, and the central figure pulsed violently, but hesitated, recognizing a new force it had never felt. The hallucinations erupted in fury, more vivid, more terrifying than ever. Endless versions of himself, faceless and screaming, multiplied infinitely through the twisted corridors, climbing walls, stretching into impossible angles. Shadows coiled like living rivers of ink, wrapping around him, pressing into every joint, every inch of flesh, while faceless loved ones screamed silently, their faces twisted in unbearable horror. The whispers surged, clawing. Surrender, belong, fail, remain, forever, join, die, or witness, submit. Ethan forced recognition, naming each illusion, confronting each fear. You are not real. I am real. I remain myself. I confront you. I bend you. I shape this nightmare. The shadows twisted, coiling into obedient forms or curling aside entirely. Faceless figures froze, then staggered, unable to maintain their relentless motion. Hallucinations shattered into fragments, collapsing the infinite versions of despair into broken, manageable shards. The central figure pulsed violently, yet Ethan could manipulate the tendrils, bending them aside, fracturing their coordinated strikes, and creating corridors where none should exist. Step by agonizing step, breath by ragged breath, he pressed deeper into the lodge's pulsing heart. Every movement shaped the shadows, every acknowledgement fractured hallucinations, every act of defiance bent the lodge's architecture. Floors that had undulated like water now held steady. Ceilings that pressed down impossibly high folded into bridges. Shadows became walls or barriers as he willed. Faceless figures froze entirely, unmoving. The lodge, eternal and sentient, was bending under the influence of a single human will. Lightning split the warped ceiling, illuminating the central figure fully. Limbs twisted in impossible angles, tendrils writhing like ink, pulsating with life and awareness. Yet gaps opened before Ethan. Shadows twisted aside. Hallucinations shattered completely at acknowledgement. The lodge groaned in recognition of his power. For the first time, he realized that he could directly confront the central figure, shape the nightmare into a battlefield where his will mattered, where survival was more than endurance. It was agency. Ethan raised both hands, voice hoarse but commanding. I am myself. Confront you. Bend this darkness. I will not surrender. I will not belong. The shadows recoiled violently, coiling into shapes he dictated, fracturing the synchronized faceless figures into chaotic, harmless forms. Hallucinations splintered, shrieking and dissolving into fragments that drifted away like smoke. The lodge's pulse quivered, its infinite darkness bending slightly under his defiance, as if the sentient nightmare itself were learning that it was no longer unopposed. The central figure pulsed one final time, tendrils lashing outward in a desperate, furious storm, yet Ethan stepped forward without hesitation. He focused on the gaps, the spaces he had carved through sheer will, and pushed, bending shadows fully aside, fracturing every hallucination in the vicinity, bending the lodge's architecture to form a clear path. He felt the lodge's pulse tremble, the sentient heartbeat unsure, its eternal rhythm disrupted by a force it could not fully comprehend. Ethan's mind sharpened to a single point of clarity. The lodge relied on fear, surrender, and submission. He refused all three. He had bent shadows, fractured hallucinations, shaped corridors, frozen faceless figures. Now, at the heart of the lodge, he confronted the eternal darkness directly, his gaze fixed on the central figure. You do not control me. I am myself. I endure. I confront. I survive. His voice echoed through the impossible space, vibrating through walls, floors, shadows, and corridors, until the lodge itself seemed to shudder in acknowledgement. The central figure pulsed violently one last time, tendrils striking outward in a desperate, chaotic surge. Shadows coiled, fractured, and reformed at Ethan's will. Hallucinations shattered entirely, dissolving into harmless fragments. Faceless figures staggered, twisted, then froze. Corridors bent and twisted, shaping themselves into a straight path leading to the central figure's heart. And then, for the first time, silence fell. The lodge's pulse slowed, trembling, uncertain, the eternal darkness yielding to the force of one defiant human will. Ethan took a final, ragged step forward, hand outstretched, voice echoing through the trembling chamber. I am myself. I'm real. I bend this darkness. I survive. The shadows recoiled entirely, faceless figures froze forever, hallucinations splintered into nothing. The central figure pulsed once, a final ripple of acknowledgement, and then, impossibly, the lodge went still. The eternal heartbeat slowed to silence. The darkness, once absolute, yielded, shaped, fractured, and bent to the indomitable force of human will. Breath heaving, body trembling, muscles screaming, Ethan stood at the heart of the lodge. Around him, the impossible corridors held steady, shadows hung frozen, faceless figures paused in eternal recognition, and hallucinations dissolved into nothing. The central figure remained, but no longer omnipotent, no longer absolute. The lodge had been confronted, challenged, and, for the first time in eternity, shaped by a single human will. Ethan's chest heaved, and for the first time since entering, he allowed himself a thought. He had survived. Not by hiding, not by fleeing, but by facing the darkness, bending shadows, fracturing hallucinations, and asserting his will against the eternal nightmare itself. Outside, rain still fell, lightning cracked, but inside the lodge, the impossible corridors, the living shadows, the faceless figures, all waited silently, acknowledging that the eternal darkness had met resistance and for now been shaped, if only slightly, by human defiance. And somewhere, deep in the pulse of the lodge, a new rhythm began, one that hinted at a fragile, terrifying possibility, that even eternal darkness could be challenged, confronted, and if one dared, bent.